She had survived 10 years alone, raising 2 children who carried the storm-gray eyes of the man who shattered her heart. And just when life had left her in the rain, jobless and desperate, she looked up and found him again. A billionaire with the power to change her life or destroy it all over again. This is not just a love story. It is a story of betrayal, family secrets, and the aching bond between a mother, her children, and the man who never knew he was their father, until one heartbreaking night forced the truth out. Before we dive in, let us know in the comments what city you're watching from, and don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss more emotional stories like this one. The world outside the diner was just a blur of gray and flashing neon, and the rain wasn't falling, it was attacking. It hit the pavement like 1,000 tiny hammers, and it felt like the sky itself was weeping for the young woman standing beneath it. Her name was Elizabeth. She was a woman built with the kind of quiet strength that only comes from fighting for every single good thing you have in life. Right now, she was fighting the wind, the rain, and the total, gut-wrenching feeling of failure. Elizabeth was a black woman, not tall, but solid, like a piece of polished mahogany wood. Her skin was a beautiful, deep brown, and usually it had a light, healthy glow. But tonight, it was pale and streaked with the rain and maybe a few unshed tears. Her hair, worn in neat, protective twists, was damp at the edges, sticking to her forehead. Her uniform, a thin, white cotton shirt and a stiff, black skirt from the local diner, was soaked through, clinging to her like a second, cold skin. But Elizabeth wasn't holding a purse or an umbrella. She was holding on to the most important things in her entire life, her twin children. They were 4 years old, a boy and a girl, and they were the only things that kept her feet on the ground. The boy, Liam, had his face pressed hard against his mother's ribs. He was a sweet, serious child with a messy mop of tight curls and eyes that were huge and liquid brown, always watching the world with a mixture of wonder and worry. His sister, Olivia, was the bolder one. She was wrapped around Elizabeth's left leg, her tiny, pink raincoat hood pulled tight. Her features were a softer mirror of her brother's, but her eyes held a fiery spark, a tiny fighter in training. They had just been thrown out of the only place that provided Elizabeth with a steady paycheck. The place was called Rose's Diner, and it was known for its decent coffee and terrible management. "Mama," Liam whimpered, his voice muffled by the wet fabric of her shirt. "Why did the lady yell at you?" "We were quiet." Elizabeth crouched down right there on the slippery, soaked sidewalk of this ordinary Canadian city street, a place that suddenly felt completely hostile. She ignored the way the cold water seeped instantly into her stockings and shoes. She just needed to be at their level. She looked from Liam's anxious face to Olivia's confused scowl. She reached up and used the back of her hand to wipe the rain from Olivia's cheek. "She wasn't yelling at me, sweetheart," Elizabeth lied softly, hating that she had to lie to them. She was just having a very, very bad night, and grown-ups sometimes forget their manners when they are upset. "But she said you stole a sandwich," Olivia insisted, her voice small but clear, cutting right through Elizabeth's heart. Elizabeth blinked rapidly, trying to clear the sudden rush of water that wasn't just rain. The manager, a woman named Janice, had actually accused her of stealing a day-old turkey sandwich from the discard bin. It was a lie, a cruel excuse to fire her because the twins, who had been waiting for her to finish her shift, had spilled a glass of water an hour before closing. "I didn't steal anything, honey," Elizabeth said, her voice firm, holding onto a shred of her dignity. "That lady made a mistake. A big mistake. We are good, honest people, Liam and Olivia. Always remember that." She pulled them both into a tight, desperate hug, inhaling the sweet, clean scent of their skin mixed with the smell of wet wool and street rain. They were her warmth. They were her whole world. And now, she didn't know how she was going to feed them tomorrow. The money she'd earned today was only enough for a cheap bus pass and maybe a can of soup. A wave of despair, heavy, cold, and dark, washed over her. She knew she should get up. She needed to walk the 5 blocks back to their cramped, one-room apartment before the last bus went. But the rain was too hard, the truth was too heavy, and her feet were too tired. Why are people so cruel? Liam asked again, his little voice sounding broken, repeating the question that Elizabeth had asked the universe 1,000 times over the last 4 years. Elizabeth pulled back just enough to look them in the eyes. Her own eyes, usually shining with resilience, were dark with exhaustion. Sometimes, honey, she whispered, her voice husky with emotion, people are cruel because they are sad, or they don't have enough love in their lives. But we have love, right? We have lots of love, Olivia confirmed, nodding vigorously, and finally, Elizabeth managed a weak, watery smile. Just as Elizabeth started to gather her strength, pushing down on her knees to stand up, a harsh, blinding beam of light hit them directly. It was so sudden and intense that Elizabeth instantly shielded her children's faces with her hands. The sound that followed was a low, powerful rumble, the kind of engine noise that doesn't belong on a neighborhood street. It was a noise that announced the presence of something expensive, something untouchable. Slowly, as her eyes adjusted, Elizabeth realized it was a car. Not just a car, but a machine that looked like it had rolled off a Billionaire's private assembly line. It was utterly black, long, and low, gleaming even through the heavy downpour. It was the kind of car people stopped to take pictures of, the kind of car she'd only ever seen speeding through the business district on television, or maybe in a spy movie. It stopped right beside the curb, close enough that a small spray of gutter water splashed against Elizabeth's cheap stockings. The windows were tinted a deep, impenetrable smoke color. For a moment, she thought it was just the driver being rude, maybe yelling at her to move out of the street lamps. She pulled the twins tighter, ready to drag them away. Then, the rear passenger window began its slow, silent, electromechanical descent. Zip! It was the most terrifying sound Elizabeth had ever heard. As the glass sank into the car door, the bright, white streetlights poured into the back seat, illuminating the man sitting there. Elizabeth's heart didn't just drop, it froze solid. The blood in her veins seemed to turn to ice. Everything, the drumming rain, the sounds of the city, the cold ache in her feet, all faded away. The man in the car was white, dressed in a suit that looked tailored in London and cost more than Elizabeth's annual salary. His suit jacket was perfectly smooth, and his white shirt collar was crisp against his strong neck. He sat casually, one elbow resting on the leather center console. This wasn't just a man. This was Aidan Thorne. Aidan was tall, maybe 6'2", with the kind of broad shoulders and lean build that suggested a history of expensive sports and personal trainers. His hair was a rich, dark brown, cut short and neat. He had a strong, sharp jawline and high cheekbones. Everything about his face was symmetrical and perfect in a severe way. But it was his eyes that truly terrified Elizabeth. They were an unnervingly clear, bright gray, like granite right after a rainstorm, and they had always held a mixture of cool intelligence and sharp intensity. He wasn't a man who missed anything. Elizabeth had prayed, begged, and worked desperately to forget that face. 4 years, she had spent putting the pieces of her life back together after he had shattered it with a careless word and a final, heartless departure. She had convinced herself that men like him, billionaire heirs to the vast Thorne Holdings empire, didn't even live in the same world as her. They certainly didn't stop on the wet, forgotten streets of her neighborhood. But here he was, larger than life, and still devastatingly handsome. Aidan was looking out the window, but his gaze wasn't on Elizabeth's stunned, terrified face. His piercing, icy-gray eyes were fixed entirely on the 2 small children huddled at her side. He didn't speak. He didn't smile. He just stayed, his expression unreadable, yet utterly focused. Elizabeth felt a primal, fierce need to hide her children, to shield them from his gaze. She tried to step back, but her feet felt like lead weights cemented to the sidewalk. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't form a single word. She remembered every detail of his betrayal, the promises he had broken, the way he had dismissed her and their entire relationship 4 years ago as if she were a temporary, charming distraction. He can't know. A silent scream went off inside her head. He absolutely cannot know. But the way his eyes tracked Olivia, then Liam, lingering on the remarkable similarity of their dark curls and their big, earnest eyes, was chilling. They were small, undeniable parts of her, but they were also small, undeniable parts of him. The silence stretched, broken only by the relentless sound of the rain. The street lamp above them hissed faintly. In that moment, the entire world was just Elizabeth, her twins, and the man who had the power to make her life either a dream or a total nightmare. The man who had done both before. Suddenly, Olivia, in her childish innocence, looked up from rubbing her eyes and pointed a tiny finger at the car. "Mama, look. That man looks like the man in your picture," she said loudly, her voice clear despite the rain. Elizabeth's blood ran cold. The picture, a foolish, treasured photograph of her and Aiden, taken on a beautiful summer day before everything went wrong, was hidden deep in a jewelry box, and she thought she had forgotten it existed. The twins must have found it while playing. Aiden Thorne finally shifted his gaze, slowly lifting those terrible gray eyes from the children to meet Elizabeth's own. His expression remained utterly controlled, but in the depths of his eyes, Elizabeth saw a flicker, a flash of recognition, confusion, and then a profound, deep shock that instantly vanished, replaced by that familiar, hard mask. He opened his mouth to speak. Elizabeth knew that if he said a single word, her life was over. Her carefully constructed independence, her quiet fight to survive, would be instantly ripped away. She had to move. Now, she bent down, scooped up both children in a rush of desperate strength, one under each arm, ignoring their protests and her aching back. She didn't look at Aiden again. She didn't wait for him to speak. She just ran. She ran off the sidewalk, across the empty street, the sound of her wet sneakers slapping the asphalt, a frantic rhythm set against the rain. She didn't stop until she was around the corner, hidden between two massive, overgrown hedges in front of a closed bakery. She put the children down, breathing hard, her lungs burning. "Mama, what are you doing?" Liam asked, scared by her sudden, frantic energy. "We're playing a game, sweetie," Elizabeth gasped, pressing a hand against her pounding chest. "It's a hiding game. Quiet. Listen." She held her breath, listening not to the rain, but for the heavy engine sound of the black car. She heard nothing. Maybe he hadn't followed. Maybe he had just driven off, dismissing her and her children as quickly as he had dismissed her 4 years ago. A wave of dizzy relief washed over her, making her lean against the brick wall. Elizabeth knew the journey ahead would be tough. She was jobless, soaked, and terrified. But looking at the two little faces staring up at her, she knew she wasn't alone. And that's what mattered. Elizabeth stayed huddled there for several minutes until the heavy rush of her own fear subsided enough for her to think clearly. She took a deep, steadying breath, one she felt all the way down to her tired toes. She had to get the twins home. Their tiny apartment was a safe harbor. It was small, dusty, and the furnace barely worked. But it was theirs, and no one there could fire her or accuse her of stealing a sandwich. "Come on, my little loves," she said, her voice now much softer, wrapping her arms around them and starting to walk again, but now at a fast, determined pace. "We are going to go home. We are going to have hot cocoa, and we are going to make a plan." As she walked, she tried to focus only on the pavement beneath her feet and the warmth of her children's small hands and hairs. She tried to convince herself that the encounter with Aiden Thorne was nothing more than a coincidence, a rich man driving through a poor area on his way to somewhere far more important. But deep in her gut, a cold, hard knot was forming. She knew better. Men like Aiden Thorne didn't believe in coincidence. And Elizabeth knew, with a certainty that chilled her more than the rain, that their worlds had just collided again. The fight for her life, and for her children's secret, had just begun. Aiden Thorne was not a man easily surprised. He was the kind of person who walked into a room and instantly took control, not through shouting, but through quiet, absolute certainty. He was a force of nature, a billionaire who commanded respect, fear, and attention. Yet, as the woman sprinted away from his car and disappeared around the wet corner, Aiden found himself completely undone. His carefully constructed composure had shattered like cheap glass. The interior of his Bentley was a sanctuary of wealth and silence, But right now, it felt claustrophobic. The air was thick with the scent of expensive leather and, now, the heavy realization that slammed into him like a runaway train. Aiden was a white man in his early 30s, a fact he rarely thought about because his power spoke louder than his age. His tailored suit jacket was charcoal gray, and the silk tie beneath it was a deep, muted burgundy, colors that spoke of boardroom battles and untouchable status. His features were sharp, almost severe, a straight, aristocratic nose, a firm mouth, and those remarkable eyes, storm gray, the color of a winter sky just before it snows. He had always been told they were his most striking feature, a symbol of the Thorne family's icy focus. 10 years. 10 years he had lived his life, built his empire, and systematically suppressed every single memory of the brief, intense summer that had introduced him to Elizabeth. The name tasted like ash and honey on his tongue. As she turned the corner, running with the desperate energy of a chased deer, Aiden finally moved. He leaned forward, pushing his shoulder against the buttery soft leather of the seat, and a single, raw sound broke through the polished silence of the car. Elizabeth. His voice was a deep, powerful baritone, a voice used to commanding multimillion-dollar deals. But it was stripped bare, etched with disbelief and a tremor of genuine shock. It cut through the steady hiss of the rain, loud enough that even the driver, a massive, silent man named Marcus, flinched slightly. But Elizabeth was already gone. Aiden stared at the empty space on the sidewalk, his jaw tightening into a rock-hard knot. His mind raced, trying to reconcile the image of the scared, drenched woman in the cheap diner uniform with the bright, laughing Elizabeth he had left behind in Jamaica a decade ago. He hadn't seen her face clearly at first. She was just a woman huddled in the rain. Then, as the window went down and the street lights hit, the years melted away. Her dark, beautiful skin, the delicate slope of her neck, the fierce protective way she held the children. It was her. No doubt. Her eyes, though clouded with fear and exhaustion, held that same intense spark of pride he remembered. His hands, resting on his knees, clenched into fists. He felt a sickening surge of regret and a sudden, fierce anger. Anger at himself, anger at the universe for this cruel, dramatic reunion. He had left her because he was a coward. He was 23, groomed to take over a massive, unforgiving corporation, and he had been instructed by his cold, powerful father to drop the island girl and focus on his destiny. He had obeyed, choosing money and power over a messy, real, inconvenient love. It was the greatest failure of his life, a soft spot he had buried so deep he thought it was gone forever. But the children, that was what stopped his breath. He replayed the image in his mind, sharpened clay. Elizabeth, crouching down, two small faces. The girl, the tiny firecracker, with her mom's skin and defiant chin. And the boy, pressed against Elizabeth's side. The boy had his eyes. Aiden felt a cold certainty settle in his gut, a heavy, sinking feeling that drove the air out of his lungs. He didn't just think the child looked familiar. He knew. That pale, brilliant gray, the color that belonged only to the Thorne lineage, the color he saw in the mirror every day. It was looking back at him from the face of a 4-year-old boy. Disbelief quickly gave way to a frightening, absolute comprehension. This wasn't a coincidence. This was the consequence of his actions, walking around on a rainy night, terrified and soaked through, right where he could see them. He had a family he never knew about. He had children. He turned his attention abruptly to the driver, Marcus. Marcus was a former military man, built like a brick wall, with quiet, dark skin and a face that never moved. He was loyal, silent, and incredibly efficient. Marcus, Aiden commanded, his voice now flat, devoid of emotion, the cold mask firmly back in place. "Did you see her? The woman who just ran?" Marcus nodded once, his eyes focused on the windshield wipers battling the relentless downpour. "Yes, sir. Ms. Elizabeth." Aiden registered the way Marcus had used her name. Elizabeth had worked briefly on the Thorne estate grounds years ago, and Marcus would have been there. It only deepened the reality of the situation. "I need you to turn the car around," Aiden continued, his voice low and dangerous. I don't care about the traffic laws. I want you to find out where she lives, where she works, everything." He paused, leaning forward to ensure Marcus understood the severity of the order. "Find out how long she has been here. And most importantly," Aiden said, his gray eyes flashing with sudden, cold fury, "find out the names of those children. You have until morning. Don't lose her again." Marcus didn't question the command. He didn't even twitch an eyebrow. "Understood, Mr. Thorne." With a silent efficiency that was terrifying, Marcus executed a tight U-turn in the middle of the street, the Bentley's powerful engine humming. But even after they circled the block slowly, scanning every alley and porch, Elizabeth and the twins were nowhere to be found. She had vanished into the wet, dark night like smoke. Aiden settled back into his seat, the leather feeling suddenly too soft, too luxurious. The contrast between his life and the scene he had just witnessed was unbearable. Elizabeth, a beautiful, fiercely intelligent woman, was battling the rain and poverty, all while raising 2 children alone. And one of them, without a shadow of a doubt, was his son. A wave of crushing guilt washed over him. He, Aiden Thorne, had spent the last 4 years building towers of glass and steel across the world, while his own flesh and blood was struggling for a turkey sandwich and a dry place to stand. His father's voice, cold and judgmental, echoed in his mind. A Thorne does not involve himself in messes. But this wasn't a mess. This was family. This was a monumental injustice committed by him. He closed his eyes, and a memory, sharp and sun-drenched, broke through the storm of his thoughts. He was standing on a porch railing in Jamaica, the air heavy with the scent of sea salt and hibiscus. Elizabeth was sitting on a swing chair, her smile dazzling, the sun turning her skin to liquid gold. She was 20, vibrant, carefree, and talking animatedly about her dream of saving money to study business management. He had told her she could do anything. She had laughed, leaned over, and kissed him deeply, a soft, lingering kiss that had promised a lifetime of warmth. He remembered the day he left. He didn't tell her the real reason. He just handed her a ridiculously large check and mumbled some pathetic excuse about his future obligations that couldn't include her. She hadn't taken the money. She had simply looked at him, her eyes turning from warm brown to cold stone, and handed the check back. "Keep your money, Aiden," she had said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "I want nothing from you." That fierce pride. It hadn't left her. It was the same pride that had made her run tonight, refusing to acknowledge him, refusing to ask for help. Aiden opened his eyes and looked out at the rain. The streetlights reflected off the car roof, making shimmering patterns. He was a man accustomed to fixing everything with a signature and a transfer of funds. But this felt different. He couldn't just throw money at this problem. This required atonement. It required facing the woman he had wronged and the children he had abandoned before he even knew they existed. The car drove in silent loops, but Aiden knew it was futile. Elizabeth had been too fast, too desperate. She was already far away, protecting her secret and her children. He rubbed his temples, a headache beginning to pound behind his eyes. He realized he was seeing his entire existence differently now. All the power, all the wealth, felt suddenly hollow. What good was ruling the financial world if he had missed the most important thing? He turned to Marcus, who was now quietly speaking into a small headset, undoubtedly starting the immense search operation. "Marcus," Aiden said softly, his voice heavy with the weight of 4 years of missed life. "The boy, did you notice anything about his eyes?" Marcus paused his conversation, his expression still neutral, but his voice was grave. "One of the children, sir. The boy. He has your eyes, Mr. Thorne." I recognized the color immediately. The confirmation, spoken aloud by an objective witness, was like a physical blow. Aiden didn't need to hear another word. His son was out there, struggling in the rain. He leaned back, resting his head against the soft, cool leather of the headrest. The world outside was a storm, but the real storm was raging inside Aiden. He had spent 10 years running from his past, and now his past had driven a cheap, soaked woman and 2 children with his own storm-gray eyes right into his path. He wouldn't let them run again. His command was absolute. Elizabeth would be found. And this time, he wouldn't leave. He would face the consequences of his abandonment, no matter how high the cost. The chapter of their separation was over. The chapter of reckoning had begun. The morning light struggled to pierce the thick layer of clouds hanging over the city. But inside Aidan Thorne's office, the atmosphere was even darker. Aidan sat behind a desk carved from dark Italian walnut, a piece of furniture that looked more like a sacred altar than a workspace. The view from his window, spanning 3 sides of the 55th floor, was a breathtaking tapestry of steel and glass, concrete and wealth. This entire world was his kingdom. Yet, he felt poorer than he ever had in his life. Spread out across the immaculate leather blotter were the cold, stark realities of another person's existence. A neat stack of papers, printed and compiled by his chief of staff, Ms. Vivian Sterling, told the grim story of Elizabeth. Ms. Sterling, a formidable white woman in her late 40s whose glasses always sat perfectly straight on her nose, had worked through the night. The report was professional, efficient, and heartbreaking. Aidan, still in the same tailored suit from the night before, hadn't slept. His eyes, the same storm gray that had led to this terrifying revelation, were ringed with fatigue, but they held a new, burning intensity. He leaned back in his chair, the soft leather sighing beneath his weight, and picked up the first page. The report began with an address, a rundown building in an older, less maintained part of the city. The kind of building where the paint peeled and the pipes rattled. Elizabeth was renting a tiny, one-room studio apartment on the 3rd floor. The rent was steep for her income. Her employment history was a blur of exhausting labor. She had been waitressing, cleaning offices, working retail, sometimes holding down 2 or 3 minimum wage jobs at once. The report noted her recent termination from Rose's Diner, confirmed by Marcus's contacts. The reason? Minor infraction leading to insubordination. Aidan snorted, knowing that minor infraction probably meant she prioritized her children over a difficult manager. Then came the punch to the gut. The names: Liam and Olivia. 4 years old, born within minutes of each other. Elizabeth, a fierce, protective woman, had used her own last name for them, cutting any connection to the Thorne legacy before it could even begin. Aidan's fingers traced the outline of Liam's name. The boy with the gray eyes. Liam. It was a good, strong name. He closed his eyes, the guilt hitting him with physical force, a sharp pressure in his chest that no amount of money could ease. He had been living in a bubble of luxury, flying on private jets and making decisions that affected hundreds of thousands of lives, while his son and daughter were eating instant noodles and freezing in a cheap, rented room 5 miles away. He didn't just feel guilt, he felt a profound, deep shame. A memory broke through the cold professionalism of the report, dragging him back 10 years to a summer that had felt like a waking dream. He had been sent to the Caribbean to manage a complicated land acquisition, a boring, bureaucratic task meant to keep him out of trouble before he took over the company reins. That was where he met Elizabeth, who was working as a junior liaison on the estate property. She was vibrant, full of life, and she saw him not as Aidan Thorne, the heir, but just as Aidan, the ambitious, sometimes awkward young man. Their romance wasn't a one-night thing as he had tried to tell himself over the years. It was weeks of sneaking away, of shared laughter under the sprawling almond trees, of long, honest conversations in the glow of the sunset. The last memory he held was the night he decided he had to leave. His father, through a blistering phone call, had given him an ultimatum: walk away from the girl or walk away from the family fortune. Aidan, paralyzed by a lifetime of expectation and fear of failure, chose the fortune. He remembered meeting her in a small, crowded bar, the city lights of Kingston casting a golden glow on her face. She was wearing a simple, bright yellow dress. He had taken her hand. "I have to go back," he had told her, his voice clipped and cold, sounding even to his own ears like a script written by his father. "My life, it's not mine right now. I have obligations." He hadn't told her about the ultimatum. He had tried to protect her with silence. But instead, he had just broken her with cruelty. He had pushed a hefty severance check across the table, a pathetic offering of money for the love he was destroying. She hadn't yelled. She hadn't cried loudly. She had simply looked at the check, then back at him, her beautiful brown eyes filling with a hurt so deep it made him physically recoil. "Keep your money, Aiden," she had whispered, her voice like sandpaper. "It's clearly the most valuable thing in your life. Don't call me again." She had stood up, still radiant in that yellow dress, yet somehow utterly changed, and walked out into the busy night. He had never heard from her again. He had told himself that she accepted the breakup, that she just got on with her life. He had spent years believing she was the one who abandoned their messy, complicated relationship by cutting off all contact and returning the check, proving she was done with him. He had even convinced himself that she was probably fine, maybe even happily married now. It was easier to live with that lie. The report shattered that lie into a million pieces. Elizabeth didn't vanish because she moved on to a better life. She vanished because she was too proud and too devastated to take his dating money, and she was forced to start over from absolute zero, already pregnant, struggling, and alone. Aiden ran a hand over his tired face. The timeline was chillingly clear. 4 years ago, she had just given birth to his children. Her desperate move from the islands to a cold Canadian city must have been motivated by the need for anonymity and any available work. She had been struggling to survive. The weight of that sentence was immense. He, the man who owned half the city's skyline, had children who were going hungry and sleeping in a damp, cold apartment. The guilt was now a consuming fire, burning away all the excuses and rationalizations of the last decade. He had been a selfish coward, afraid of his father's disapproval more than he was afraid of shattering the heart of the woman he loved. He straightened up in his chair, the action decisive, the billionaire back in control, but now driven by a completely different force. This wasn't about land deals or market shares. This was about family. This was about justice for Elizabeth and his children. He needed to fix this, not with a check, not with a cold arrangement, but with honest effort and accountability. His first step had to be to ensure their immediate safety and well-being. He couldn't just barge in, not after the way she ran last night. She would fight him with every fiber of her being. He knew that pride. He needed a strategy that respected her independence while providing the help they desperately needed. He picked up the phone on his desk, the movement smooth and confident. "Vivian," he said into the intercom, his voice a low, steel rumble. "Cancel my board meeting. Clear my calendar. Call my personal legal team. I need them on standby. And call Marcus. I need a secured, fully furnished apartment ready for immediate occupancy. Discreetly. It needs to be spacious, warm, and far away from that address on the report. I also need detailed, anonymous surveillance on the mother and children, but absolutely no direct contact." He paused, the immense weight of his new responsibility settling over him. He wasn't just fixing his mistake. He was stepping into a role he never asked for, but one he was now fiercely determined to fulfill. "And Vivian," he added, his voice softer now, "find the very best pediatrician in the city, and a child key expert. I don't know anything about being a father, but I'm going to learn. Start now." He hung up the phone and looked out at the city he ruled. It was still gray, but for the first time in years, Aiden Thorne felt a flicker of warmth and hope in his chest. He had a purpose beyond wealth. He had 2 children and a woman he had wronged, and he was going to spend the rest of his life making it right. Justice was coming for Elizabeth, not as a gift, but as a debt that needed to be paid. Aiden pushed the files away, standing up from his desk. The luxury of the office no longer felt empty. It felt like a tool, a resource to be deployed in his new mission. He looked at the vast, wealthy city below, but all he could see was the tiny, damp, third-floor apartment and the tired, beautiful face of the woman who had carried his legacy, alone, for 4 years. He would make sure they were safe. He would make sure they were warm. He would bring hope back into their lives, even if it meant tearing down his own empire to do it. Aiden Thorne didn't wait. When a man like him makes a decision, especially a life-altering decision fueled by guilt, recognition, and a fierce, newfound purpose, he moves mountains to see it through. He had spent the entire day issuing commands, rearranging his empire to create a bubble of security for his unsuspecting family. But fixing the past on paper was easy. Facing the woman he had wronged was the only way forward. He didn't go back to Rosie's diner. Marcus's detailed, discreet report had found her at a different, even shabbier place, a 24-hour spot called the Gridlock Grill, located right on the edge of the industrial area. It was the kind of place where tired truckers and graveyard shift workers went for cheap, lukewarm coffee and a heavy dose of grease. As the evening deepened, Aiden walked into the Gridlock Grill. The change in atmosphere was immediate and complete. The air in the diner, usually thick with a scent of old frying oil, cheap bleach, and stale cigarettes, suddenly felt electrified. The room itself seemed to hold its breath. Aiden was dressed impeccably, in a midnight blue suit that looked like liquid silk, a crisp white shirt, and shoes that shone under the flickering fluorescent lights. He was clean-cut, sharp, and carried the invisible aura of billions of dollars. He looked like an alien who had accidentally materialized in the wrong quadrant of the universe. The 15 or so people scattered throughout the booths, a few solitary workers, a pair of exhausted paramedics finishing their shift, and the grizzled countercook, all paused. Their conversations died in their throats. Every eye swiveled to the stranger standing just inside the entrance. His presence was simply too loud, too expensive, too commanding for the chipped plates and sticky, red vinyl booths of the diner. And then, Aiden saw Elizabeth. She was serving a table near the back, wearing a pale blue polo shirt that was one size too big and black pants that had faded in countless washings. Her hair was pulled back tightly, and the exhaustion from her double shifts was visible in the faint shadows beneath her eyes. Her skin, the color of rich earth, seemed muted under the harsh, sickly yellow light. She was bent slightly, listening to an order, and her professionalism was automatic, a mask she wore to survive. She didn't look up, didn't sense him, not until he moved. Aiden, ignoring the gaping stays, walked with a slow, deliberate pace to the counter, taking a stool directly across from the busy food pass. He didn't sit down. He just stood there, tall and unyielding, a statue of refined fury and cold determination. The movement caught Elizabeth's attention. She straightened up, holding a small stack of dainty plates, ready to turn toward the kitchen door. Her eyes, weary and dull a second ago, snapped wide open the moment they landed on him. All the exhaustion vanished, replaced by a pure, raw panic. It was a look of someone cornered, trapped with nowhere left to run. It had only been 24 hours since she had last seen him in the storm, but it felt like a lifetime. She had spent the night awake, trying to convince herself that his appearance was a bad dream, a terrible vision conjured by her panic and fear. Seeing him now, here, in her place of survival, was the solid proof that her nightmare was following her. Her hands, holding the plates, started to shake violently. Not just a little tremor, but a rapid, uncontrolled shudder that traveled all the way up her arms. The small glass of water sitting precariously on top of the pile of dishes slipped. It hit the edge of the counter and exploded in a delicate, horrible spray of water and sharp fragments. The noise, tiny as it was, sounded deafening in the sudden, deep silence of the diner. Elizabeth didn't even flinch at the shattering sound. Her gaze was locked on Aiden, a desperate plea and a fierce, warning challenge battling in the depths of her dark brown eyes. The counter cook, a big, red-faced man named Stan, finally broke the tension. "Hey, Elizabeth, you all right? Watch your hands." Elizabeth forced herself to look away, the training of a decade kicking in. "I'm fine, Stan," she managed, her voice tight and barely a whisper. She dropped the remaining plates into the washing basin, grabbed a rag, and rushed back out to clean up the mess, her movements stiff and unnatural. Aiden watched her. He saw the tremble in her fingers as she swept up the glass shards. He saw the sheer, grinding effort it took for her to plaster a weak, professional smile on her face for the elderly couple in the corner booth who were watching the drama unfold. He saw her pain, her fear, and her monumental exhaustion, and the sight only fueled his resolve. He wasn't leaving until he had answers. He finally sat down at the counter. Stan slid a menu toward him, looking nervous. "What can I get for YA, pal?" Stan asked. "Just water," Aiden replied, his voice low, steady, and utterly out of place. He didn't look at the menu. He didn't look at Stan. He kept his gaze fixed on Elizabeth, who was now carefully wiping the small puddle of water from the floor. She finished the cleanup, her back straight, and forced herself back behind the counter, trying to avoid his intense, focused stare. She busied herself polishing silverware, her movements mechanical, a furious rhythm of silver against cloth. She was determined to ignore the most powerful man she had ever known, the man who had shattered her life 10 years ago. The next 2 hours were an agonizing slow-motion torture for Elizabeth. Aiden sat there, drinking the single glass of water, his presence a heavy, undeniable weight. He didn't call her over. He didn't cause a scene. He just waited, silent and immovable, until the last shift change finally arrived. At 11 p.m., Stan gave Elizabeth a tired nod. "You're done. Go get some rest." Elizabeth slipped off her apron, her relief quickly replaced by a fresh wave of terror. She knew this was his plan. She walked purposefully toward the back exit, the one that led to the alley where she usually waited for the bus. She had her small purse clutched tightly, her shoulder bag heavy with a cheap plastic container holding the leftovers she planned to share with the twins tomorrow. She pushed open the heavy steel door and stepped out into the cold, damp night. A massive, dark shadow instantly moved out of the alley's deep recess. It was Aiden. He was leaning against the brick wall, his silhouette imposing and dark against the lone security light. He had been waiting outside for her. He blocked the alley. There was no escaping him now. Elizabeth stopped dead, her heart hammering against her ribs like a captive bird. She didn't want him to see her fate. She lifted her chin, pulling on that fierce, inherited pride that had kept her going for 10 years. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice surprisingly steady, though it felt like grit paper scraping her throat. "This isn't your neighborhood. I suggest you leave before someone calls the police." Aiden pushed off the wall and took a single, slow step toward her. His expression was cold, his storm-gray eyes fixed on hers with an unnerving intensity that stripped away all her defenses. "Don't call me Mr. Thorne," he said, his voice a low, hard rumble that barely carried over the distant traffic noise. It was a voice edged with an undeniable, yet controlled, fury. "Don't pretend you don't know who I am, Elizabeth." He took another step, closing the distance between them until he was standing just a few feet away. She could smell the crisp, expensive scent of his cologne, the scent of power and betrayal. "I have the reports, Elizabeth," he continued, his tone flat, emotionless, but his eyes were blazing. "I know where you live. I know how you live. And I know you have twins, Liam and Olivia." Elizabeth swallowed hard. The mention of their names, spoken by him, felt like an invasion, a violation of the sacred, small world she had built around them. He didn't waste any more time on preamble. He went straight for the heart of the matter, his voice dropping even lower, demanding the truth. "Those children," he said, the words cutting through the air like sharp glass. "Are they mine?" The question hung in the air, heavy and absolute. The moment felt massive, the culmination of years of loneliness, struggle, and silent sacrifice. This was a moment where the truth could change everything, where her secret could explode her life, or where a lie could keep her safe for a little while longer. Elizabeth looked into those familiar, terrifying gray eyes. She saw the truth reflected there. He already knew the answer. The question wasn't about knowledge. It was about forcing her hand, forcing her to acknowledge the history and the consequence between them. She took a slow, deep breath, pulling strength from the memory of Liam's anxious questions and Olivia's small, defiant nod. She had protected them for 4 years. She would not stop now. She would not give Aiden Thorne the power to waltz back into their lives just because he finally decided to open his eyes. With every ounce of pride she possessed, she lifted her chin, meeting his challenging gaze with her own. "No," she said, the word ringing with a forced, fragile conviction. Her throat tightened around the sound, but she pushed it out, firm and cold. "They are not yours." It was a lie. A monstrous, necessary lie. Aiden's jaw flexed, a small muscle twitching beneath his smooth skin. He saw the fierce fire in her eyes, the desperate wall she had put up. He knew she was lying. He saw the way her body was taut with tension, the way her legs were trembling despite her rigid posture. But he also saw the absolute determination. He wanted to reach out, to grab her, to shake her until she admitted the truth, but he knew that would only make her retreat further. She had survived him once. She would survive him again. He let the silence stretch, letting his disbelief and anger hang between them. Elizabeth didn't flinch. She just held his gaze for one more excruciating moment. Then, with a sharp intake of breath, she turned her back on him. She started walking down the dark alley, her footsteps small and quick on the rough pavement. Her legs were shaking so badly she felt like her knees might buckle and drop her right there onto the cold ground. But she forced herself to walk, one painful step after another, her back straight, maintaining the illusion of control. She didn't look back. She couldn't. Aiden watched her go. He watched her until her silhouette merged with the shadows at the end of the alley. His fists were still clenched, his entire body rigid with suppressed emotion. He had achieved the encounter, but he had failed to get the truth. He stood there for a long moment, the scent of garbage and cold night air filling his lungs, overriding the expensive scent of his cologne. He felt like a fool and a deeply frustrated father. He knew she was protecting the children from him. The man who had abandoned her once, she thought he would certainly do it again. Aiden finally allowed himself to let out a long, slow breath. He knew this lie was a challenge, a test of his commitment. He had to prove he wasn't the coward he was 10 years ago. He pulled his phone from his pocket and pressed a button. "Marcus," he instructed, his voice low and hard, infused with a new, quiet resolution. "The plan changes slightly. She is not going to cooperate. Start the preparations on the apartment immediately, and I want the best family lawyer in the country ready to meet me tomorrow morning. I will not have my children growing up like this. She may deny them, but I will claim them, and I will do it the right way." He didn't turn to leave until he heard the distant, muffled sound of a bus pulling away from the corner, Elizabeth's bus. He had expected an easy confession, a torrent of tears, a simple moment of justice. Instead, he got a stone wall and a defiant, heartbreaking lie. Elizabeth's refusal to surrender was simply a testament to the strength he had always loved about her. Aiden knew the fight ahead would be long and brutal, but looking at the shadows where she had disappeared, he felt a quiet surge of resolve. He would respect her pride, but he would not accept her lie. He would find a way to honor her struggle and bring his children into the warmth they deserved. He would not fail his family again. Elizabeth walked into her small apartment that night and felt a wave of cold exhaustion wash over her, heavy and complete. The air inside the room was stale, the radiator giving off a sputtering, meager heat that did little to fight the damp chill of the rainy night. But the moment she heard the small, sleepy sounds of her children, she shed the immense weight of Aiden Thorne and became only Mima. The apartment was not much, just one main room that served as living room, bedroom, and sometimes, with a pulled curtain, a tiny office. The kitchen was just a counter and a sink crammed into a corner. Yet, it was clean, organized, and filled with the evidence of love. A crayon drawing taped to the wall, two small, identical teddy bears sitting neatly on their shared trundle bed, and the comforting, slightly sweet smell of their children's soap. Liam and Olivia were awake, bundled under their thick, mismatched blankets. They had been looked after by the kind, elderly Jamaican woman who lived down the hall, Ms. Hyacinth, a second grandmother who was paid more in gratitude and small errands than actual money. "Mama, you're so wet," Olivia announced, sitting straight up and pointing an accusing finger at Elizabeth's damp, wrinkled uniform. "I had a little argument with the rain, sweetheart," Elizabeth answered, forcing a lightness into her voice she didn't feel. She dropped her heavy work bag with a soft thud and rushed to kneel by their bed. She needed to touch them, to prove to herself that they were real, safe, and still hers. Liam was quieter, his storm-gray eyes Elizabeth tried desperately not to notice, wide with concern. "Did the man with the shiny shoes hurt you? Why did he come to your work, Mama?" Elizabeth tucked the blanket closer around his small, firm shoulders, her hands trembling slightly, but she steadied them through sheer willpower. "He's just Nobody. My sweet boy. Just a very lost man who took a wrong turn. Grown-ups do that sometimes. But he kept looking at us, Olivia whispered, her brow furrowed in confusion. He looked like the picture, Mama. The memory of the children finding that old photograph of her and Aiden, the one she thought was safe, sent a fresh jolt of fear through her. She forced a bright smile onto her face. That old picture? Oh, that was a silly photo of a silly, long-ago mistake, Elizabeth said, her voice soft and reassuring. That man is just a stranger, Olivia. We don't talk to strangers, remember? She hugged them both, burying her face in the clean, soft curve of their necks, inhaling their familiar, precious scent. She held them longer than necessary, drawing strength from their warmth. She whispered the lie again, not just for them, but for herself. Is nobody. You two are my everything. Now, time for sleep. I'll tell you the story about the dancing fireflies. Okay. She spent the next hour with them, distracting them with a bedtime story, singing their favorite lullaby in a low, gentle croon, and finally watching their eyelids flutter closed. Only when their breathing settled into the deep, even rhythm of sleep did Elizabeth finally pull away. She sat on the edge of the cheap, threadbare couch, the last of her adrenaline draining away, leaving her hollow and cold. She pulled her knees up to her chest, resting her chin on them. His nobody. The lie tasted bitter. She knew the truth. Aiden Thorne was not a man who got lost, and he was certainly not a man who took no for an answer. That quiet, restrained fury she had seen in the alley tonight was not the temper of a man walking away. It was the focus of a predator preparing for a hunt. She replayed the encounter, his imposing silhouette, the sharpness of his suit, the shocking intensity of his question. Are they mine? She had lied with conviction, her pride giving her the strength to deliver the fatal blow to his suspicion. She did it not because she truly hated him, but because she loved her children more than she feared him. She knew that Aiden Thorne's interest was not a benevolent rescue. It was an annexing, a takeover. He would try to fix them with money, lawyers, and the cold, unfeeling power of the Thorne name. And in doing so, he would rip them away from the quiet, loving life she had built. Her independence was the only thing she had left. Her ability to keep them safe and raise them with her own values was her entire worth. She wouldn't surrender it for the sake of his late-onset conscience. She was a mother fighting to protect her cubs, and she would fight the world, even if the world came dressed in a $10,000 suit. She knew she had bought herself some time, maybe a day, maybe two, but the storm had been let loose. Aiden would never let this go. She had to start making a real plan, a desperate plan to disappear again, to relocate, to find another anonymous corner of the world where she could raise her children in peace. Meanwhile, 50 floors above the chaos of the city, in his gleaming, silent glass tower, Aiden was also locked in a torment of his own making. He had returned to his penthouse, stripped off the dark suit that now felt like a cage, and was pacing the length of his living area. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a spectacular view of the entire city, a view that usually calmed his expansive mind. Tonight, it did nothing but reflect his own frustrated image back at him. He was a man used to winning. His life was a series of successful conquests, hostile takeovers, lucrative deals, and immediate compliance from everyone in his orbit. Elizabeth's sharp, decisive denial was like a bucket of cold water thrown onto his burning determination. He poured himself a glass of expensive whiskey, but didn't drink it. He just held the cold glass, staring into the amber liquid, seeing only the defiance in her dark, deep brown eyes, eyes that still held the memory of the light and laughter he had extinguished a decade ago. He replayed the confrontation, dissecting every detail. The trembling of her hands, the flicker of fear that instantly transformed into a shield of icy pride, the way her chin lifted in that familiar, stubborn gesture he remembered from their arguments. No, they are not yours. He had seen through the lie instantly. The lie was delivered with too much force, too much desperation. It was a lie born not of malice, but of fear. Fear of him. He hated that she feared him. He hated that he had made her life so hard that the sight of him now, A man who could solve all her problems with a single phone call, terrified her more than poverty itself. And then there was Liam. Aiden walked over to the windows and leaned his forehead against the cool glass. He didn't need a DNA test. He needed only to close his eyes and recall the 4-year-old boy's face, the serious expression, the way his curls framed his sweet features. But it was the eyes that sealed it. The storm gray eyes. That rare, distinctive color was a Thorne genetic marker, passed down through generations. Elizabeth's eyes were dark and rich. Liam's were his. It was a truth written in genetics, a truth Elizabeth couldn't hide no matter how desperately she lied. Aiden had built his empire on patience and strategy. He never rushed. He analyzed, planned, and executed. He knew that forcing the truth from Elizabeth tonight would only result in her packing up those children and vanishing forever, maybe even leaving the country. He couldn't risk that. He needed to play the long game. He needed to prove to Elizabeth that he was not the careless, cruel young man who left her 10 years ago. He needed to prove that his intentions were pure, that he wanted to provide warmth, education, safety, and love, not just a handout or a legal battle. He picked up his phone and called Marcus. "The apartment. Is it ready?" Aiden asked, his voice low and firm. "It will be ready before dawn, Mr. Thorne. Secure building, private school registration pending, fully stocked pantry," Marcus replied, his voice a calm anchor in Aiden's storm. "Good. Don't touch her. Don't approach her. I want a complete, anonymous record of their daily routine," Aiden ordered. "Where they go, what they eat, their interests. Everything. I need to understand their lives completely before I make my next move. Her pride is too fierce. If I approach her again directly, I will lose them both." He hung up, feeling a small, tight knot of resolve form in his chest. His empire had taught him patience, yes, but it had also taught him to leverage every asset. His greatest asset right now wasn't his money. It was the love he knew he had for those two small strangers. He just had to find a way to show Elizabeth that love was real and that he wouldn't run this time. Aiden had already spent the day setting up legal protections, ensuring that even if Elizabeth ran, she couldn't take the children far without his knowledge, guaranteeing their safety first and foremost. He was preparing for a custody battle, yes, but he was hoping for a reconciliation. He didn't just want to take his children. He wanted to partner with their mother. He walked back to the window, the image of Elizabeth's defiant face filling his mind. She was protecting them. That much was clear, and her protection was a force as formidable as his own wealth. Aiden knew the story was not ending here. This was just the beginning of a long, emotional war waged over the fate of their two children. He wouldn't rest until his son and daughter were safe, warm, and knew their father's love. And he wouldn't rest until Elizabeth finally, truly believed that he was not going to break her again. He had left her once, the biggest mistake of his life. He wouldn't make the same mistake twice. He had to be patient, relentless, and above all, genuinely good. Aiden Thorne's penthouse was magnificent, a breathtaking expanse of minimalist architecture and priceless art. But his parents' home, the Thorne family estate, was something else entirely. It wasn't just big. It was ancient, a monument to old money and a cold, unforgiving kind of power. It sat on acres of manicured land outside the city, a heavy stone fortress draped in ivy, looking down on the world as if nothing below it truly mattered. It was in the estate's grand, cavernous library, a room full of leather-bound books and the scent of history and dust, that Aiden broke the news. He stood facing his parents, Harold and Penelope Thorne. They were a picture of severe, generational wealth. Harold, the patriarch, was a man in his late 60s, ramrod straight, with silver hair meticulously combed and a face set in a permanent expression of subtle disapproval. His eyes were the same striking gray as Aiden's and Liam's, but in Harold, they were utterly devoid of warmth, like chips of ice. Penelope, Aiden's mother, was draped in expensive silk, her jewelry glittering under the chandelier light. She was elegantly thin, her blonde hair perfectly coiffed, but her beauty was sharp, and her mouth, usually set in a polite, brittle smile, was now pulled down into an expression of pure, refined horror. Aidan laid the facts out plainly. No softening, no excuses. He told them he had found Elizabeth and that she had given birth to twins, his son, Liam, and his daughter, Olivia. The air in the library went from merely cold to absolutely arctic. Harold Thorne didn't yell. He didn't have to. His rage was a quiet, controlled force, far more terrifying than noise. He lowered himself slowly into a velvet armchair, his movements deliberate. A waitress, Harold finally scoffed, the word dripping with contempt, as if it were the filthiest thing he could imagine. He didn't even acknowledge Elizabeth's name. You are telling me, Aidan, that after all the effort we have poured into you, the schooling, the training, the positioning, you have fathered children with a woman who serves food for a living. Aidan felt the familiar, hot flare of rebellion, the feeling he had suppressed since he was a teenager. He remained outwardly calm. She is a good woman, father, an honest, hard-working mother, and she is the mother of my children. Honest, hard-working. Harold laughed, a short, unpleasant sound that sounded like glass grinding. Aidan, she hid your children from you for 4 years. This is a scheme, a calculated move to seize a piece of the Thorne fortune. She's a gold digger who has waited for the perfect moment to drop this bomb. Aidan shook his head, the truth of Elizabeth's desperate, proud denial ringing in his ears. She refused my help 10 years ago, and she lied to me last night, telling me they weren't mine, just so I would leave her alone. She wants nothing to do with the Thorne money. She is fighting for her independence. Oh, please, Harold sneered. That is a tired, predictable story, son. It's a drama she's playing to pull at your romantic, foolish heartstrings. This waitress will destroy our reputation. Think of the board, Aidan. Think of the shareholders. We cannot have this kind of low-class scandal attached to the name. But Penelope, the cool, collected mother, was the one who delivered the most painful blow. Her face was pale, her expression twisted by a venomous cocktail of shock and disgust. That black woman will never be part of this family, she stated, her voice trembling slightly, not from weakness, but from the depth of her hatred. Do you hear me, Aidan? We tolerated your little summer fling years ago, a temporary lapse in judgment. But to bring this mess into our legacy, to have 2 mixed-race children with a woman of that background and profession, no, absolutely not. Aidan felt his control finally snap. He took a step toward his mother, his own gray eyes hardening into the color of unforgiving steel. You will never speak about Elizabeth or my children that way again, he warned, his voice low and dangerous, a tone they had never heard from him before. Their skin color means nothing. Their mother's job means nothing. They are my blood, and they are going to be taken care of. Penelope recoiled slightly at his intensity, but she quickly recovered, her voice rising to a shrill, desperate pitch. Taken care of? By doing what? Marrying her? Making her the co-owner of Thorne Holdings? You already have an obligation. Have you forgotten the Livingston deal? Harold leaned forward, seizing the opportunity to redirect the argument back to business, the only language Aidan had been raised to understand. Your mother is right, Harold said, his voice regaining its cold authority. Your engagement to Serafina Livingston is finalized. The announcement is next month. This merger will make us the most powerful financial entity in the Western Hemisphere. You cannot throw away $1 billion legacy for a sentimental, reckless mistake and a pair of unwanted children. Serafina Livingston was the heiress to a massive European media and banking empire. Her family was white, old-world wealthy, and impeccably connected. The proposed marriage was not about love. It was about the cold, calculated union of 2 financial dynasties. Aidan had always accepted it as his destiny, the final price of his birthright. His parents hammered the point home, their voices weaving together in a suffocating tapestry of expectations. You need to be ruthless, Aidan, his father insisted. Give the woman money, a huge amount, enough to keep her silent, comfortable, and far away. She signs a complete non-disclosure agreement and gives up all claims to the children. We put the twins through the best schools, discreetly, under a private trust, but they never bear the Thorne name in public. This is the only way to minimize the damage. It's the only way to save the family name, his mother added, pleading now. You can't ruin yourself, Aiden. You can't ruin us. But Aiden's mind wasn't on mergers or reputation. It was on the cold, wet streets of the night before. It was on the damp uniform, the cheap diner, and the fierce, unyielding pride in Elizabeth's eyes when she looked him in the face and lied to protect her children. He saw the picture of Liam, his small face serious, his eyes shining with that unmistakable gray light. He saw the timeline. The night he walked away, the desperate move she must have made to save her dignity and her babies. He realized in that moment that all the wealth and privilege he possessed had taught him absolutely nothing about real life. It had only taught him how to be cruel, selfish, and cowardly. His parents were offering him the easy, expensive way out, the Thorn way, but he suddenly wanted no part of it. He pushed his hands deep into his trouser pockets, taking a moment to gather his thoughts, his entire future hanging in the balance. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured and steady, carrying a quiet force that silenced his parents completely. I won't be paying her off, Father, and I won't be abandoning my children, Aiden said. They are 4 years old. They need their mother, and they need me. They will bear the Thorn name, and I will be in their lives. Fully. He looked directly at his mother, his expression one of absolute resolve. I do not care about the Livingston merger, and I do not care about your reputation. I have spent my entire life doing what was best for the Thorn name. Now, I'm going to do what is right for my family. My real family. Harold Thorne's face went white with shock and impotent fury. He struggled to his feet, knocking a small, antique silver frame to the floor. You are throwing away billions. Harold roared, finally losing his composure. You are ending your career. I will disown you, Aiden. I will cut you off entirely. Aiden met his father's gaze, calm and steady. You can do what you need to do, Father. But my mind is made up. I spent 10 years running from the consequences of my mistakes. I won't run anymore. He turned away from the cold, beautiful library, away from the expectations that had chained him his entire life. He left his parents stunned and spitting threats in the expensive silence of their mansion. Walking back out into the late afternoon air, Aiden felt a lightness he hadn't experienced in years. The air was crisp and cool, but inside him, a powerful, determined fire was burning. He had chosen the hardest path, the path of truth and justice, over the easy path of wealth and lies. He had chosen Elizabeth and his children over the Thorn Empire. He knew his parents would fight him. They would use every legal, social, and financial weapon at their disposal to stop him. But seeing the venom in their eyes and hearing the casual cruelty in their voices only reaffirmed his decision. He had to save his children from this cold, heartless legacy and bring them into a life that was based on something real, something warm. He had to become the kind of man Elizabeth could look at without fear. The only thing that mattered now was Liam, Olivia, and the fierce, proud woman who had raised them alone. Aiden was coming for his family, and this time, he was bringing love, not betrayal. The tiny park at the center of Elizabeth's neighborhood wasn't much. Just a few rusty swings, a sandbox with more weeds than sand, and a couple of sun-faded benches. But for Elizabeth, it was a sanctuary. It was a place where she could watch Liam and Olivia run and laugh, briefly forgetting the cold weight of Aiden Thorne's sudden return. It was in this park, on a crisp, bright Saturday morning, that she found the anchor she desperately needed. His name was Dr. Adrian Marcus. He wasn't the Marcus who drove Aiden Thorne's Bentley. This man was a world away from wealth and corporate power. Adrian was a local family physician, a black man in his late 30s with a gentle, reassuring presence. He was tall and lean, with warm, intelligent eyes and a kind face often framed by a subtle, caring smile. He wore simple, practical clothing, often a pressed khaki shirt and comfortable jeans, looking more like a kind uncle than a highly respected doctor. Adrian had been the twins' doctor since they were born. He was the one who had seen Elizabeth through bouts of the flu, the occasional scraped knee, and the relentless, exhausting stress of raising 2 children completely alone. He knew, without ever asking, that Elizabeth was perpetually struggling. Elizabeth had learned to lean on his kindness, not financially, but emotionally. He was the one person she trusted implicitly. On this particular morning, Adrian was sitting on a bench while the twins tried, and failed, to reach the high bar on the swing set. Elizabeth was sitting beside him, the early autumn sun warming her face. "They are getting so tall," Adrian observed, his voice a low, soothing sound. "Liam is going to be dunking a basketball by age 7, I swear." Elizabeth allowed herself a genuine, unforced smile, the first one she'd worn in days. "He gets his energy from somewhere. Not from me, lately." "You need to slow down, Elizabeth," Adrian said, his tone shifting gently to that of a concerned friend. He reached over and placed a hand lightly on her arm. "You took on that third cleaning job this week, didn't you? You look exhausted." Elizabeth pulled her arm back subtly. She appreciated his care, but she never wanted to burden him. "It's temporary. The bills don't stop just because I'm tired. I have to keep running." She didn't tell him the real reason she was running, the fear that Aidan Thorne was closing in. She couldn't, because Adrian's solid, dependable presence felt like a shield, and she was terrified of exposing him to the kind of darkness that followed Aidan. Adrian had shown up at her door late one evening last winter with a box of groceries when the roads were iced over. He knew she hadn't eaten a full meal in 2 days because he'd noticed her weight loss at their last appointment. He brought hearty soups, fresh milk, and the kind of good, fresh bread she couldn't afford. He always made it feel like a professional courtesy, never charity. She deeply admired his goodness. He was the exact opposite of the entitled, cold-hearted men she had encountered in her past. He was reliable, generous, and truly saw her, not as a symbol of poverty or a past mistake, but as a strong, worthy woman. "You don't always have to run alone, Elizabeth," Adrian said quietly, turning to face her fully. He spoke slowly, emphasizing each word, letting the sincerity sink in. "We are a community, and I want to be here for you. More than just a doctor, if you'd let me." Elizabeth's throat tightened. She looked at him, seeing the genuine light in his eyes, and a terrifying thought crossed her mind. "I could be happy here." But she quickly shoved the thought away. Happiness wasn't a luxury she could afford. Not when she had twins to protect, and certainly not when a billionaire shark was circling her waters. She had convinced herself long ago that she deserved nothing more than the fight she was in. She didn't deserve a good, decent man like Adrian. "Adrian," she began, choosing her words carefully. "You are an amazing friend, and the best doctor in this city. You've done so much for me and the twins. That's enough." She knew her words were cold, a protective wall she built against the possibility of a love that could be crushed. Adrian understood her boundaries, and he accepted her decision with a sad, gentle nod. He knew her history had left her deeply guarded. It was exactly at that moment, as Adrian reached over to playfully adjust Olivia's bright pink hat, that the massive, black Bentley turned the corner onto their quiet street. Aidan Thorne, who had spent the entire morning tracking their routine through discreet, long-distance surveillance, had finally decided that watching wasn't enough. He had to see this friend, who was invading his personal space, sitting on a bench where he should have been, touching his children's mother. The car stopped with the quiet, powerful finality of a closing bank vault. Aidan stepped out. He was dressed in high-end casual wear, dark jeans, a luxurious cashmere sweater, and a tailored wool coat. But even in relaxed clothes, he looked like a magazine cover come to life. He radiated power and intent. He walked onto the path toward the park, ignoring the strange looks from the few neighbors around. His eyes were immediately locked on Elizabeth, but then they zeroed in on the man sitting next to her, the man whose hand was near Elizabeth's shoulder. A raw, primitive spark of jealousy, sharp and hot, flared in Aidan's chest. He had spent his life dealing with rivals in the boardroom, competitors who wanted his assets. This felt different, deeper, and far more personal. This man was sitting in the space that Aidan should have occupied for the last 4 years. Elizabeth saw Aidan the moment he set foot on the grass. Her breath hitched, and her body instantly tensed, going rigid as stone. Her brief moment of peace shattered into 1,000 pieces. "Mama, look! It's the man from the shiny car!" Olivia cried out, pointing, drawing Adrian's attention. Adrian stood up, his gaze moving from the excited children to the menacing figure striding across the park toward them. He immediately sensed the danger, the aggressive energy of the imposing stranger. Aiden walked straight up to the bench. He didn't look at the children. He didn't look at Adrian. He looked only at Elizabeth, his gray eyes piercing and cold. "Elizabeth," he said, his voice low, his breathing tight. He didn't bother with pleasantries. Elizabeth stood up, putting herself squarely between Aiden and Adrian, her stance defensive. "I told you, Aiden. Leave us alone." Aiden ignored her. His gaze finally shifted to Adrian, raking over the doctor's simple, kind clothing. The unspoken comparison between the two men, the billionaire versus the simple, local doctor, was brutal. "Who is he?" Aiden demanded, the question sharp and possessive, clearly implying ownership over her and her world. The tone was edged with a dangerous, restrained jealousy that surprised even Aiden himself. Adrian, despite the man's obvious wealth and intimidation, remained calm and solid. "I'm Dr. Marcus, their family physician, and her friend." Aiden scoffed internally at the word friend. He knew what friend often meant in situations like this. A quiet, patient man waiting on the sidelines. "Elizabeth," Aiden pressed, his gaze snapping back to her. "You have exactly one chance to tell me the truth. Is he?" He paused, struggling to spit out the word. "Is he the father of the children?" The question was ludicrous, especially given Liam's gray eyes, but Aiden needed to know the depth of this rival's involvement. Elizabeth felt a surge of cold fury at his entitlement. How dare he arrive after 4 years of abandonment and interrogate her about the only good, kind man who had stayed by her side? This was her chance, her final, best defense. She looked at Adrian, gathering strength from the doctor's steady presence, and then she turned back to Aiden, meeting his gaze with unyielding hatred. Her voice, though low, was clear and precise, carrying the full weight of her past pain. "He is the man who was here," she said, letting the words sink in slowly. "The man who took care of me and my children when they were sick. The man who brought groceries when I had nothing left to feed them." She stepped closer to Aiden, her eyes flashing with defiance. "He is the man who was there when you weren't." The words landed on Aiden Thorne harder than any physical blow. They were the absolute, perfect, devastating summary of his failure and his betrayal. They contained all the truth she had refused to speak, packaged into a simple, undeniable fact. The color drained from Aiden's face. The jealousy and anger instantly dissolved, replaced by a deep, agonizing stab of guilt. He had built skyscrapers and commanded markets, but he had failed at the only thing that truly mattered, being present. He had been absent, and this kind, simple doctor had filled the void. He couldn't argue with her words. They were cold, pure justice. Elizabeth looked at Adrian, then back at the defeated expression on Aiden's face. She knew she had won this round. She grasped the twins' hands. "Come on, my loves," she said, her voice now softer, aimed only at the children. "Let's go home now." She turned her back on Aiden Thorne and walked away, Adrian falling into step beside her, his presence a silent, steady contradiction to the chaotic, powerful man left standing alone in the park. Aiden stood motionless, his entire body stiff with shame, watching the small, united family walk away. He saw Adrian gently placing a hand on Liam's back as they left the park. The casual intimacy of the gesture, the easy, earned trust, was unbearable. He had the money, the power, and the biological tie. But Adrian Marcus had the love, the trust, and the history of unwavering presence. Aiden finally understood the true depth of the competition he faced. He wasn't fighting for custody. He was fighting for the chance to prove he was worthy of her forgiveness and her children's time. He had to become the kind of man who would have been there from the start. The tension in Elizabeth's small world wasn't just coming from the angry silence of the alley or the cold rejection in her words. It was radiating right from the heart of her life, her 2 children. Elizabeth had been fighting a war to keep Aiden Thorne out, But the war was already happening inside their home, waged by the simple, powerful forces of childhood curiosity and raw, unfiltered intuition. Aiden, following his determined plan, did not try to corner Elizabeth again. Instead, he started appearing near the park or near the bus stop in the late afternoons, always careful to keep his distance from the protective figure of Dr. Adrian Marcus. He never initiated contact with Elizabeth, but he started leaving small, impossible-to-ignore tokens. It started with the park. One afternoon, when the twins were trying to play in the miserable, damp sandbox, a brand-new, massive blue plastic sandbox, clean, filled with perfectly white, sifted sand, and equipped with a shiny set of new toy trucks and shovels, magically appeared in the unused corner of the small play area. It was an anonymous gift, delivered late at night, but Elizabeth knew exactly who had orchestrated the silent, expensive invasion. Another time, the thin, flimsy plastic cover that shielded the twins' bicycles on their balcony was suddenly replaced by a heavy-duty, commercial-grade waterproof awning installed while Elizabeth was at work. It was all subtle, practical, and devastatingly effective. It was the wealthy man's way of saying, "I see your struggle, and I am correcting it, whether you like it or not." But the real drama unfolded on a Tuesday, when Aiden was waiting across the street from their school, standing beside his black car, looking every bit the sophisticated, successful father waiting for a late-shift pickup. Elizabeth hated herself for noticing how good he looked, how his expensive coat seemed to shrug off the chill of the afternoon, or how his gray eyes searched the schoolyard with a focused intensity that meant business. When the school bell rang, the wave of children rushed out, and Liam and Olivia quickly spotted their mother. But then, their attention snagged on the tall, imposing figure across the street. The twins' reactions, as always, were opposites. Liam, the sweet, gentle boy with the striking storm-gray eyes, paused. He was all curiosity and innocent trust. He saw the expensive car, the sharp clothes, and the man who didn't look angry, just serious and steady. Liam broke free from Elizabeth's hand and, before she could even react, he walked right up to the curb. He didn't cross the street, but he stood at the edge, tilting his small head and looking up at Aiden with an expression of pure wonder. Aiden, who had been practicing this moment in his head for days, crouched down slowly, dropping down on one knee to meet the boy at eye level. This was a move he had learned from reading parenting books the lawyers had supplied him. Always meet the child on their level. "Hello," Liam said simply, his small voice bright and trusting. Aiden's throat tightened. He opened his mouth, but the grand, prepared speech about being his father died on his tongue. All that came out was a quiet, slightly husky, "Hello there. You must be Liam." Liam nodded proudly. "Who are you?" "I am a friend of your mama's," Aiden lied, knowing it was necessary. Liam considered this for a moment, then pointed a small, gloved finger at Aiden's tailored wool coat. "You have a very nice car, Uncle." The word, uncle, hit Aiden like a lightning bolt. It was a title of family, of acceptance, of simple, innocent trust. It was an unexpected, powerful victory. Aiden felt a sudden, profound wave of warmth wash through him, completely overwhelming his careful composure. He reached out and gently took Liam's hand, the small, trusting grip melting away the hard stone of years of emotional isolation. "Thank you, Liam," Aiden managed, his voice genuinely moved. "It's nice to meet you." He didn't pull away when Liam started tugging gently on his hand, the small, insistent pull of a child seeking connection. But the moment was instantly shattered by the other twin. Olivia was a few feet away, pressed tightly against Elizabeth's side, clutching her mother's coat with white knuckles. Olivia was the sharp, fiery one, the one with the gut instinct. She had been watching the entire exchange, her big brown eyes narrowed into slits of suspicion and clear disapproval. "Don't touch him, Liam," Olivia suddenly yelled, her voice high and sharp with warning. "Is not our uncle." Elizabeth quickly rushed forward, pulling Liam back to her side, her face a mask of panic. Olivia, safe under her mother's arm, glared at Aiden with all the ferocious anger a 4-year-old could muster. She stuck her tongue out quickly, An immediate, blunt rejection that was far more hurtful than any adult insult. She then whispered loudly to her mother, loud enough for Aiden to hear, her voice a low, furious mutter. I don't like him. He makes you sad. The honest, brutal assessment cut Elizabeth deeply. Olivia hadn't even met him before he started appearing in her life, yet she felt the shadow he cast over her mother. She sensed the sudden tension, the sleepless nights, and the suppressed fear. Elizabeth quickly scooped up both children, turning her back on Aiden. She walked away at a near run, her heart pounding not just from fear, but from the searing pain of that moment. Back in the apartment, with the warmth of the inadequate radiator on her back, Elizabeth sat the twins down for their dinner of reheated leftovers. But she herself couldn't eat. The image of Liam's trusting hand in Aiden's massive palm warred violently with the memory of Olivia's defiant glare and her devastating words. He makes you sad. Elizabeth had spent her life teaching her children about strangers, about caution, and about the fundamental importance of trusting one's own feelings. Now, her children were caught in a terrible, emotional tug-of-war, and she realized the devastating truth. She was losing them already. Liam's innocent acceptance of Aiden as uncle showed how desperately he craved a father figure, a male presence that stood tall and strong. He was reaching out for the comfort and authority that Aiden naturally radiated, blind to the pain and betrayal attached to that figure. Olivia, however, was a mother's mirror. She was fiercely protective, seeing past the fancy coat and the powerful smile, and straight to the fear and misery in Elizabeth's heart. Olivia's rejection of Aiden wasn't about the man. It was about the threat he posed to the stability and happiness of her mother. This tug-of-war cut Elizabeth more deeply than Aiden's initial abandonment. She couldn't let him claim them. Her pride and her survival instinct screamed against it. Yet her children were already being pulled toward him in ways she couldn't control. If she continued to shut Aiden out completely, she risked turning Liam against her, creating a resentment for the mother who denied him the connection he clearly desired. If she gave in, she risked letting Aiden's cold, wealthy world swallow them whole, erasing the simple, honest values she had worked so hard to instill. She walked over to the small, grimy window and looked out at the lights of the city. She knew that Aiden, sitting in his glass tower miles away, was probably celebrating Liam's innocence, acceptance, and analyzing Olivia's defiance. He was patient, relentless, and using his power to gently, silently dismantle the protective wall she had built. Aiden, back in his penthouse, was indeed celebrating, though quietly. He stood by his window, holding the untouched whiskey glass again, a look of profound concentration on his face. He had expected fear, maybe tears, but not the simple, genuine warmth of that small hand in his. Uncle. The word resonated with him, a soft, loving title that made him feel connected, human, and overwhelmingly responsible. He also registered Olivia's fierce rejection. He knew, from his father, that children often inherit their parents' deepest emotions. Olivia hadn't gotten his eyes, but she had certainly inherited Elizabeth's fighting spirit and her deep, mistrustful intuition. She was the one he had to win over with concrete actions, not just gentle words. Aiden had been a strategist his entire life, and he recognized the situation for what it was, a full-scale battle for the hearts of his children. His parents were still breathing down his neck, threatening legal and financial ruin if he didn't terminate the mess, but their venom only hardened his resolve. He called Marcus. The apartment is ready, correct? Yes, Mr. Thorne. It's fully furnished, stocked, and secured. 3 bedrooms, a small library set up for the children. Good, Aiden said. Now, I need you to find a very specific school. Not the most expensive one, the one with the best reputation for warmth, diversity, and individualized attention. And I want the best child psychologist in the city, but one who specializes in grief and single-parent transitions. I need to understand how to approach Olivia. He wasn't just planning an invasion. He was planning a foundation. He wanted to give his children stability and opportunity, but he knew he had to address the emotional scars his abandonment had already created. He looked at the tiny, distant lights of Elizabeth's neighborhood. He He knew he was the only source of the conflict in her life, the pain that made her sad. And the only way to heal that pain was to be the man who stayed, the man who was worthy of her forgiveness. Aiden knew the battle was only beginning, but with Liam's acceptance and Olivia's fierce challenge, he had found his motivation. He was no longer just claiming his blood. He was fighting to become the father they deserved, no matter what their proud, betrayed mother said. He would use his wealth and power not for conquest, but for unconditional protection, a love that would ultimately force Elizabeth to lower her guard. The ballroom of the Grand Regent Hotel was a shimmering spectacle of old-world glamour and new-world money. Crystal chandeliers dripped light onto a sea of imported marble, illuminating gowns that cost more than Elizabeth's yearly salary and jewelry that belonged to museums. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume, cigar smoke, and cold champagne. This was the annual Thorne Foundation Charity Gala, the high society event that cemented the Thorne name in the city's hierarchy. Elizabeth was there, but not as a guest. To keep her children fed and the rent paid while Aiden Thorne continued his silent, unsettling campaign of costly gifts and surveillance, Elizabeth had taken on a catering job for the night. She wore the staff uniform, a stiff, ill-fitting white blouse and black trousers, a badge of invisibility in this world of glittering excess. Her job was to navigate the crowds, collect empty glasses, and remain unseen. It was humiliating, but she reminded herself that every glass she must put milk in her children's cups. Her eyes scanned the crowd, constantly searching for Aiden, who was the very center of the universe tonight. He was impeccably handsome, standing taller and sharper than anyone else, but his gaze was preoccupied, constantly flicking toward the service doors. Beside him stood his fiancée, Isabella Moreau. Isabella was the epitome of inherited elegance, a tall, slender white woman with severe blonde hair styled into a perfect knot and eyes the color of ice cubes. Her designer gown was a shimmering cascade of green silk, a color that screamed wealth and sophistication. Isabella was not just Aiden's fiancée. She was a partner in the impending merger, a businesswoman as ruthless and calculating as Aiden's father, Harold. Her beauty was weaponized, and her smiles were only for the cameras. Isabella had found out the truth the way all secrets come out in those circles, through careless gossip from a jealous socialite who overheard Penelope Thorne venting about the Waitress problem. Isabella didn't care about Aiden's fidelity. She cared about the threat to the merger and, more importantly, the threat to her reputation as the future matriarch of the Thorne Empire. She had spent the evening watching Elizabeth, calculating her moment. The opportunity came near the main bar, just as Elizabeth was struggling to balance a heavy silver tray of empty flutes. Isabella approached her, moving with the quiet grace of a shark. She dismissed a small circle of admirers and stood directly in Elizabeth's path, her green silk dress a blinding contrast to Elizabeth's simple white shirt. "You're the little distraction, aren't you?" Isabella asked, her voice low and silken, carrying the unmistakable chill of disdain. Elizabeth froze, her heart instantly beginning to hammer against her ribs. She kept her eyes lowered, refusing to meet the gaze of the woman who held the life Aiden Thorne had chosen. "I'm sorry," Elizabeth murmured, trying to step around her. "I have to clear this tray." Isabella reached out a perfectly manicured hand, tipped with a diamond the size of a pigeon's egg, and stopped Elizabeth's arm. Her grip was surprisingly strong. "Look at me when I speak to you," Isabella commanded, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper only Elizabeth could hear. "My fiancé has a bad habit of collecting strays. But this one won't stick, darling. We are merging empires. We don't have time for cafeteria workers and their little surprises." Elizabeth finally looked up. Her brown eyes, though exhausted, held a deep, unyielding dignity. "My children are not surprises, and I am not a stray, Ms. Moreau. I suggest you keep your cruel opinions to yourself." Isabella laughed, a short, sharp sound that didn't reach her eyes. "Feisty. I understand the temporary appeal. But you need to understand your place. Your place is here, wiping up our messes, not trying to sit at our table. People like you should know their place." She took a deliberate step back, her eyes moving to the glass of dark, expensive red wine she held. It was a deep, rich burgundy, the color of spilled blood. "Oops," Isabella whispered, a wicked smile spreading across her lips. With a swift, controlled movement that was clearly intentional, she swung her elbow, sending the entire glass of wine soaring through the air. The liquid landed with a shocking, wet splat directly across the front of Elizabeth's pristine white uniform shirt, staining it immediately from shoulder to hip in a ghastly, spreading crimson pattern. The temperature in the small corner of the ballroom plummeted. A few guests gasped. Elizabeth felt the cold, sticky liquid seep instantly into the cheap fabric. The humiliation was total. It wasn't just a stain. It was a physical mark of the contempt this world held for her. Tears instantly sprang to her eyes, not from the cold wine, but from the brutal public cruelty. She wanted nothing more than to drop the tray and run, to disappear back into the safety of her cramped, poor world. "Clean that up, waitress," Isabella said, her voice loud enough now for the nearest guest to hear. "And get back to the kitchen. You're an embarrassment." Elizabeth stood paralyzed, tears blurring her vision, when suddenly, two small, furious voices cut through the polished murmurs of the stunned crowd. "Leave our mama alone. You're mean. Stop it." Liam and Olivia burst into the scene. Elizabeth had left them sleeping soundly in a tiny, unused coat closet in the staff area, having bribed a kind cleaning lady to watch them until her shift ended. They must have woken up and, hearing the commotion near the entrance, had bravely sought her out. They rushed forward, seeing their mother standing helpless, her white shirt covered in the terrible red stain, and seeing the elegant, sneering woman towering over her. Olivia, the fiery defender, ran straight toward Isabella, her small hands balled into tiny fists. She wasn't tall enough to reach the woman's face, so she did the next best thing. She hammered her fists against the shimmering green silk of Isabella's expensive gown, trying to protect her mother. "Bad lady, you hurt Mama," Olivia shouted, her small face contorted with outrage. Liam, the gentle one, stood in front of Elizabeth, his body a small, shaky shield. He looked up at Isabella, his beautiful storm gray eyes blazing with a shocking clarity of anger. "Say sorry to our Mima," Liam demanded, his voice trembling but firm, echoing the defiance of his mother. The sight was devastating. Two small, innocent children in their mismatched, slightly worn play clothes, fiercely defending their soaked, humiliated mother against a woman draped in diamonds and cruelty. The silence that fell across the ballroom was profound. Everyone, the socialites, the CEOs, the media, stopped breathing. Then, from the side door, like a thunderclap, came the whirring sound of motor drives, followed by a blinding, explosive series of white lights. The paparazzi, who always hovered at these events, had seen the commotion and recognized the key players: the fiancé of the city's most powerful billionaire, an unknown woman, and two small children. Flash! 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 The lights captured everything. Isabella's look of stunned, malignant fury, Elizabeth's tear-streaked face and the crimson stain, and the two small twins, their bodies rigid with protective love. A moment later, Aidan himself, alerted by the sudden, dead silence and the blinding flashes, shoved his way through the crowd. He took in the entire scene in a single, agonizing glance. Elizabeth, soaked in wine, Isabella, raging and flustered, and his two children, their faces red with effort, defending their mother. His heart swelled with a raw, undeniable pride for his children's courage, followed by a terrifying cold fury aimed squarely at Isabella. "Isabella, stop this now!" Aidan roared, his voice cutting through the noise. But the moment was already immortalized. The children had delivered the final, most powerful blow of the night. By the time the city woke up, the scandal was everywhere. The morning newspapers, the digital news feeds, and the social media sphere screamed the story. Aidan had immediately pulled Elizabeth and the children out of the hotel, ignoring Isabella's protests and his parents' horrified pleas. He had whisked them away in his car, driving Elizabeth and the still-shaking twins back to her apartment, ordering Marcus to deliver new, warm clothing and food immediately. The scandal was not what his parents expected. The pictures were undeniable. The elegant, furious Isabella and the two small, brave children standing up to protect their mother. The world saw the vulnerability of the working mother and the powerful, unfeeling malice of the elite. Sitting in her small kitchen later that morning, with the twins finally sleeping peacefully in their bed, Elizabeth read the headlines with tears streaming down her face. They weren't tears of shame or fear, but of profound gratitude and overwhelming love. Her children, her brave little heroes, had stood up for her when she couldn't stand up for herself. They had publicly defended her dignity and exposed the truth of the Thorne family's coldness in a way she never could have. Aidan called her, his voice heavy with contrition and rage. "Elizabeth, I am so sorry," he said. "I'm ending the engagement. I'm done with all of them. This is unforgivable." Elizabeth simply looked at the photograph on the newspaper, her twins, faces set in determination. She realized the truth. Her strength wasn't her ability to fight alone. It was the two small warriors she had raised. Her refusal to be broken had finally paid off, not in wealth, but in a public moment of justice and love that money couldn't buy. The shame was not hers, it was theirs. The battle for her reputation was over. Her children had won it with their shining, innocent bravery. She was no longer just the waitress. She was the mother of the little heroes. And the world was finally on her side. The noise of the city, the shouts of the vendors, and the blare of distant car horns were a world away from the quiet living room where Elizabeth finally decided to speak her truth. It was the day after the gala. The scandal was still a bonfire on every news channel, but Elizabeth had retreated to the safety of her small, worn apartment. Aidan was there, not in his usual tailored suit, but in a simple dark shirt, looking less like a billionaire and more like a man facing the gallows. The children were safely at Dr. Adrian Marcus's practice for a long-overdue checkup, giving them this fragile moment of privacy. Aidan sat on the edge of the threadbare couch, his head in his hands. He hadn't stopped apologizing since the night before, his voice thick with shame over Isabella's cruelty and his family's casual malice. "I've ended the engagement," Aidan said, his voice flat. "I have cut off all contact with my parents. I'm going to legally acknowledge Liam and Olivia today. I'm going to spend the rest of my life proving to you that I'm not them, Elizabeth. I just need you to trust me enough to let me help." Elizabeth stood by the window, running her finger along the dusty sill. She looked at him, the powerful man stripped bare by his own family's actions, and saw not the cold, careless heir who left her, but the deeply wounded young man she had once loved. The wine stain on her uniform was gone, scrubbed away, but the stain on her soul from years of bitterness remained. It was time to scrub that away, too. She took a deep breath, turning to face him. Her voice was quiet, almost a whisper, but every word carried the weight of 10 years of struggle. "It's not about the money, Aidan. It's not about the scandal. It's about what happened 10 years ago," she began, her dark eyes steady on his. "You think I just walked away? You think I was too proud to take your money and too indifferent to say goodbye? That was your convenient story, wasn't it?" Aidan looked up, his gray eyes confused. "You handed back the check and told me not to call. I thought you just wanted me gone. I was a fool, but I respected your decision." "My decision?" Elizabeth laughed, a short, bitter sound devoid of humor. 2 weeks after you left, Aidan, I found out I was pregnant. With the twins. I was terrified. Alone. I knew what your family was like. I knew I couldn't face it by myself. But I couldn't bear to keep it from you, either. Aidan's body went rigid. He stared at her, utterly shocked. "You were pregnant? With twins? Why didn't you tell me?" "I tried," Elizabeth said simply. "I tried with everything I had." She walked toward the worn kitchen table, placing her hands on the chipped formica. Her voice broke slightly as the memories rushed back, the raw terror of that time. "I found your father's assistant's number. I was shaking so badly I could barely dial the phone. I asked, I begged, for your number, your address, anything," she recalled, her voice thick with emotion. "I told her it was urgent. I said I needed to see you right away. She told me you were traveling and unavailable. She told me to send a letter to the Thorne main office and they would forward it. Elizabeth paused, gathering her strength. So I wrote, she continued, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. I wrote 4 letters, Aiden. The first one was hopeful, full of fear and questions. The last one was desperate, just saying that I was pregnant and that I needed to know if you were alive. I poured my heart out. I used registered mail. I even went down to the main post office myself to make sure they were properly addressed to your attention at Thorn Holdings. She looked straight at him, challenging him with the pain in her gaze. I waited, Aiden. 4 months. I lived next to the phone, jumping every time it rang. I saw the doctor. I got bigger. I got sicker. And I waited. I called the Thorn office again, and they told me you were too busy and that you hadn't replied to my previous communications. Eventually, the number was blocked entirely. Not one letter was ever answered. Not one call was ever put through. Elizabeth finally let the tears fall, though she made no sound. When I was 7 months pregnant, and I still hadn't heard a word, I packed my bag. I realized that your silence was the answer. You didn't just walk away from a fleeting affair. You knew I had tried to contact you, and you had chosen the money and the quiet life your family demanded. You had coldly, absolutely abandoned me and your unborn children. She wiped her tears fiercely with the back of her hand, her pride reasserting itself. That's why I ran. Not because of a silly check, but because I realized that the man I loved was dead, and all that was left was a callous businessman. I decided that my children deserved a life built on my honest strength, not on the charity of a man who chose to vanish. The air was heavy, charged with the sheer force of her buried pain. Aiden listened to the entire story, and with every painful detail, his face grew darker, his powerful jaw clenching so hard that the muscle jumped in his cheek. He didn't interrupt, but his storm-gray eyes burned with a mixture of horror, disbelief, and a terrifying, dawning realization. When Elizabeth finished, the silence was deafening. Aiden finally stood up. He didn't pace. He walked to the center of the room, his movements stiff and measured, a man fighting to contain an internal explosion. I never got those letters, Elizabeth, he whispered, the sound a low, ragged rasp. Not a single one. I never knew you tried to call. I never knew you were pregnant. He slammed his fist, not into the wall, but into the palm of his other hand, a sound like a gunshot in the small room. When I left, I went to Europe and then Asia for 2 years, following my father's mandate. I was completely cut off from private contact, my correspondence handled entirely by my father's personal secretary, a man named Mr. Peterson, who was notorious for his discretion, Aiden explained, his voice rising, fury beginning to color his tone. Every piece of non-business communication had to be screened and filtered. I thought it was just standard Thorn protocol. Now I know. He began pacing, his steps heavy. My family didn't just disapprove, Elizabeth. They didn't just want me to forget you. They buried you. They intercepted everything. They ensured that not one word of your pregnancy, your fear, or your desperation ever reached me. His chest heaved with deep, shuddering breaths. The sophisticated facade was gone, replaced by a son's absolute, venomous rage against his own blood. The pieces clicked together with terrible speed. His father's casual cruelty, his mother's venom toward the black woman, Isabella's calculated malice, and the quiet, controlled chaos of the Thorn machine. They didn't just try to break them up. They actively, coldly severed the connection, ensuring that Aiden believed Elizabeth had vanished without a word, and Elizabeth believed Aiden had coldly abandoned her when she needed him most. They did this, Aiden spat out, his voice a low, dangerous growl. My father, my mother, they didn't just break us up, Elizabeth. They convinced you I abandoned you, and they convinced me you walked away without a second thought. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a fresh, terrible heartbreak. I spent 10 years thinking you didn't love me enough to fight for us. You spent 10 years thinking I was a monster. They orchestrated every moment of our separation, every day of your suffering. Elizabeth stared at him, the hatred and resentment that had been her steady companion for a decade beginning to crumble, replaced by a horrific, blinding clarity. She had been wronged not by Aiden's indifference, but by his family's deliberate, sophisticated evil. She looked at the man standing before her, trembling with rage and regret, and saw the truth. He had been a victim too, trapped in the gilded cage of his family's expectations, denied the knowledge of his own children. Aiden walked toward her, slowly, tentatively, and reached out. This time, Elizabeth didn't pull away. He gently placed his hands on her shoulders, his gaze intensely locked on hers. "Elizabeth," he said, his voice husky with unshed tears. "I swear to you, I would have answered. I would have come back for you. For our children. We have been robbed of 4 years of our children's lives. But I will not let them steal another day. I'm going to make this right. And I'm going to bring down the whole rotten empire they built on our pain." The shame that had broken Elizabeth was now replaced by a fierce, shared resolution. The years of isolation were over. She finally knew the truth. The man who had been the source of her deepest pain was not the true enemy. A common enemy had been revealed. The fight had shifted. It was no longer Elizabeth against the world. It was Elizabeth and Aiden against the heartless power that tried to destroy them. They finally had the truth, and with it, the foundation for a new beginning. The Thorne family estate, usually a sanctuary of controlled quiet, became a battleground. Aiden drove back to the mansion immediately after leaving Elizabeth, the raw truth of his mother's betrayal fueling an unstoppable, searing rage. He didn't call ahead. He didn't wait for an invitation. He burst into the library where he knew his father, Harold, and his mother, Penelope, would be plotting their next move against him. Harold Thorne was sitting by the colossal stone fireplace, nursing a crystal glass of brandy. Penelope was meticulously reviewing a seating chart for a cancelled social event, utterly absorbed in the trivial details of her life. They both looked up, annoyed by Aiden's sudden, thunderous entrance. Aiden didn't bother with greetings. He walked straight toward his mother, his face a mask of white-hot fury, his gray eyes blazing with a destructive intensity they had never seen directed at them. "Where are they?" Aiden demanded, his voice low and vibrating with contained power. "Where are the letters, Mother? The ones Elizabeth sent me 10 years ago. The ones telling me I was going to be a father." Penelope Thorne's composure, usually unbreakable, fractured for a fleeting second. Her eyes widened, and a tiny, almost imperceptible tremor ran through her silk-draped shoulders. Harold, always the strategist, stood up slowly, putting himself between his son and his wife. "Aiden, calm yourself. You're being dramatic. You need to focus on the damage control from the gala," Harold began, his voice firm, trying to assert his authority. Aiden cut him off, roaring, "Don't tell me to be calm. 4 years, Father. 4 years of my children's lives, and 10 years of Elizabeth's suffering. You kept the truth from me. Did you burn the letters, Mother? Did you just throw them in the trash?" Penelope stared at her son, and slowly, a cold, hard resolve replaced the brief flicker of fear. She reached up and placed a hand on Harold's arm, signaling him to step aside. She would handle this. "Yes, Aiden," Penelope said, her voice chillingly steady, stripped of all maternal warmth. "I disposed of them. Every piece of communication she attempted to send. The letters, the calls, the visits. I instructed Mr. Peterson to filter her out completely." The admission hung in the air, a physical weight of betrayal. Aiden felt the room swim, the reality of her cold, deliberate malice hitting him like a punch to the gut. "Why?" Aiden whispered, the question a raw plea, trying to find a shred of humanity in the woman who had raised him. "How could you do that? They are my children." Penelope lifted her chin, her expression hardening into a terrifying mask of self-righteousness. "I did it because I saved you from ruining your future," she declared, her voice rising with sudden, fierce conviction. "You were 23. You were about to inherit the largest corporate empire in this country. You couldn't be tied down to some island girl and her unexpected babies. It would have been a scandal that would have destroyed your credibility and our merger prospects forever." She waved her hand dismissively, as if swatting away a fly. "She was a distraction, Aiden. A beautiful, tempting distraction. But the Thorne name demands focus. We had to ensure you remained free to fulfill your destiny. I did what was necessary for the family." Aiden couldn't believe the chilling lack of remorse. She saw his children not as human beings, but as obstacles to a favorable stock valuation. Harold, seeing his wife's confession had only escalated the situation, stepped forward again, placing a heavy hand on Aiden's shoulder. "She did the right thing, son," Harold said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial, firm whisper. "She made the difficult choice. That woman and her bastard children will drag you down into a mire of social disaster and financial instability. They are not one of us. They never will be. Cut them a check, make them disappear, and marry Isabella. It's the only way forward." The use of the word bastard and the easy, callous dismissal of Liam and Olivia was the final blow. The last, fragile thread of his loyalty to his parents snapped. Rage, pure and blinding, finally consumed him. It was a terrifying, unrestrained force that had been building inside him for 10 years, the suppressed fury of a man who had never been allowed to live his own life. He violently shrugged off his father's hand, his shoulder connecting with Harold's jaw, sending the elder man stumbling back in shock. "Those children are mine," Aiden roared, the sound echoing off the library's high ceiling, shaking the very stillness of the mansion. "They are legitimate heirs to this name, and Elizabeth is worth more than every stone in this house and every penny in your bank accounts." He pointed an accusatory, shaking finger at Penelope. "You didn't save me, Mother. You didn't protect me. You stole my life. You robbed me of the chance to know my son and daughter. You are a monster. You are a cold, calculated piece of filth." Tears of pure, visceral anger streamed down Aiden's face, a sight his parents had never witnessed. He wasn't the controlled CEO anymore. He was a betrayed son and an enraged father. 10 years, he yelled, the word tearing from his throat. 10 years stolen from me. 10 years stolen from her. You chose to inflict pain and suffering on a good woman and keep me in the dark, just to secure a merger? You call that love? You call that family? Harold straightened up, his face pale with a mix of shock and his own rising fury. "If you side with her, Aiden, you will lose everything. The Thorn name, the company, the board will turn on you. I will personally ensure you are left with nothing." Aiden looked at his father, and for the first time, he saw not a powerful figure, but a pathetic, insecure old man trapped by his own obsession with status. "You don't get it," Aiden said, the anger suddenly hardening into a cold, terrifying resolve. "I don't care about your company. I don't care about your name. I'm already richer than you'll ever be, Father, because I have something real. 2 children who stood up to your horrible fiancé last night with more courage than you've ever shown in your life. I have Elizabeth, a woman who is strong enough to raise them alone without your dirty money." He took a final, sweeping look around the opulent library, seeing the gilded prison he was finally escaping. "Consider me gone," Aiden said, his voice flat and final. "You can try to fight me in court. You can try to fight me on the board. But you will never see those children. You will never speak to their mother. Your reign of cold, calculated cruelty ends today. I will protect my family from you with every resource I have." He turned on his heel and walked out, leaving his parents standing motionless in the dust of their collapsing world. He didn't look back at the grand estate, the symbol of the very thing that had been used to separate him from his true happiness. The betrayal was complete, the rupture final. Driving away, Aiden felt the shame of his family's actions, but beneath it, a powerful new emotion was taking root, a deep, profound sense of freedom. The truth had been revealed, the enemy identified, and the ties cut. He was finally free to be the father and the man Elizabeth deserved. The fight to protect his family and build a future based on honesty and love had just begun. He had lost 10 years, but he wouldn't lose another day. The quiet victory that Elizabeth and Aiden had found in the shared truth was short-lived. The Thorn family, realizing they had lost the emotional war and that Aiden was irrevocably gone, decided to use the only weapon they had left, the ruthless, unfeeling power of the law. It happened on a cold Tuesday afternoon. Elizabeth was rushing to get the children bundled up for their weekly visit with Dr. Adrian Marcus, the only man in her life who still represented uncomplicated kindness. There was a heavy, unfamiliar knock on the door of her small apartment. When Elizabeth opened it, she was confronted not by a neighbor or a friend, but by two people in impeccable, severe suits. They were ice-cold, older lawyers who smelled of expensive cologne and paper, the kind of people who spent their lives dissecting the lives of others. The lawyers had stern, closed-off faces that showed no trace of warmth or empathy. "Are you Ms. Elizabeth?" the woman, whose nameplate read Ms. Henderson, asked, her voice clipped and professional. Elizabeth nodded warily, instinctively pulling the children back behind her legs. "We represent the interests of Mr. and Mrs. Harold Thorne," Ms. Henderson stated, holding out a thick stack of documents. "We are serving you with this order." Elizabeth took the papers with a trembling hand. The title, printed in bold, harsh lettering, was terrifying: Petition for Emergency Temporary Guardianship and Custody Review. She looked down at the words, and the simple, relatable English of the documents turned into a swirling vortex of legal jargon and crushing fear. But the core message was devastatingly clear. The Thorne family was suing for custody of Liam and Olivia. The documents painted a grim, distorted picture of her life. They detailed the inadequate, cramped living conditions of her apartment, the low wages of her jobs, the lack of private school education, and even referenced the public scene of intoxication and conflict at the charity gala. Isabella's wine spill, spun as Elizabeth's own drunken outburst. The language was venomous, accusing her of parental neglect and arguing that the twins' best interests required immediate removal from her unstable and financially insecure environment and placement with a wealthy, stable, and morally superior Thorne grandparents. Elizabeth's legs nearly gave out. She didn't have to read the fine print. She understood the threat. They were using her poverty and her struggle against her. They weren't fighting for love. They were fighting for control and reputation. She looked up at the lawyers, her eyes burning with sudden, desperate tears. "You can't do this. I'm their mother. I've raised them alone." Ms. Henderson's partner, a thin, gray-haired man, offered a sterile smile that didn't reach his eyes. "The court will decide, Ms. We advise you to contact legal representation immediately. You have 48 hours to respond." They turned and walked away, leaving Elizabeth standing in her doorway with the heavy, terrible papers in her hand, the sound of her expensive leather shoes clicking down the hall echoing like hammer blows against her heart. The children, sensing their mother's sudden, total breakdown, rushed to her. "Mama, what's wrong?" Liam asked, his small voice filled with worry. Elizabeth dropped to her knees, clutching the papers to her chest and pulling her twins into a desperate, ferocious embrace. Her body shook with sobs she couldn't control. "Nothing." She wept into their hair, the tears soaking their small shirts. "Nothing is wrong, my loves. I will never give you up. Never. I will fight them until the very last breath in my body." That evening, the moment Elizabeth could reach Aidan, the floodgates opened. She was past anger. She was broken, terrified, and clinging to the last shred of his sanity. Aidan was in his office, working furiously with his own team of lawyers to formalize the disinheritance of his parents and the establishment of a trust for Elizabeth and the children, when Elizabeth's tearful call came through. The moment he heard the panic in her voice and the words "custody papers," all the cool, controlled rage he had maintained since the revelation of the betrayal evaporated. It was replaced by a savage, blinding fury that focused entirely on his parents. He didn't waste time making plans. He left his office, ignoring his staff's protests, and drove straight to the Thorne estate for the second time in as many days, intent on utter destruction. He found his father, Harold Thorne, in the massive, mahogany-paneled dining room, sitting alone at the end of a 40-foot table, reviewing stock reports. The scene was absurd in its cold formality. Aidan walked into the room, his eyes blazing, ignoring the footman who tried to announce him. "You filed custody papers," Aidan stated, his voice devoid of volume, but thick with absolute, lethal certainty. Harold Thorne lowered his reports slowly, removing his reading glasses. He looked up, his face set in a look of grim satisfaction. "It was necessary, Aidan. A surgical strike to force your hand. The twins are minors. and Elizabeth is demonstrably unfit. Aidan didn't let him finish. He slammed his hands flat onto the polished mahogany table, the noise echoing like a thunderclap. He leaned in, his face close to his father's, his breath coming in ragged bursts. "You don't understand what you've done," Aidan hissed, his voice trembling with a rage that bordered on madness. "You didn't just hurt her, Father. You threatened my children. The only thing I care about in this entire, miserable, gilded life." "Nonsense," Harold scoffed, trying to maintain his patrician calm. "We're protecting the legacy. Once the courts see her financial situation, they will grant us guardianship. We'll raise the children properly, away from the scandal. You can still salvage the merger." "I don't want the merger," Aidan roared, finally letting the full force of his fury loose. He grabbed the pile of stock reports and swept them across the room, sending papers flying and scattering on the expensive Persian rug. He stood fully upright, towering over his seated father, and delivered the final, non-negotiable ultimatum. His voice, though loud, was terrifyingly clear. "You listen to me, old man," Aidan spat, using the contemptuous title for the first time. "You call your lawyers now. You tell them to withdraw those papers. You tell them that if they don't, I will personally sell every share of Thorn Holdings that I own, starting tomorrow morning." Harold's eyes widened in genuine panic. "Aidan, you can't. That's a controlling share. It would crash the market. It would devalue the company by half. The board would revolt. You'd destroy decades of work." "Exactly," Aidan confirmed, his face cold as stone. "And that's just the beginning. I will call a press conference. I will expose every one of your racist, calculated, illegal actions, the buried letters, the intercepts, the financial schemes. I will publicly detail how you and Mother drove Elizabeth to poverty and stole 4 years of my children's lives. I will personally ensure that the name Thorn becomes synonymous with malice and corporate corruption." He leaned down one last time, his voice dropping to a low, chilling whisper. "I will walk away from this empire tomorrow morning, but I will not walk away alone. If you come after them again, you will lose me too, and you will lose everything you have ever built. The choice is yours. The twins stay with their mother, or the entire Thorn empire burns to the ground." Aidan turned and walked out of the massive dining room, leaving Harold Thorn paralyzed, his face ashen, finally understanding that his son was not bluffing. The foundations of the empire, which had withstood every financial crisis and corporate war, were shaking violently, threatened not by a competitor, but by the love of a father finally choosing justice over greed. The legal threat, meant to crush Elizabeth, had instead become the tool for Aidan to finally, irrevocably dismantle his parents' power. He knew they were evil, but he also knew they were too obsessed with money and status to let their life's work vanish overnight. The immediate danger was averted, but the cost of the victory was a declaration of war against his own blood. Aidan didn't care. He was going back to Elizabeth and his children, and this time, he was bringing his own army. The fragile peace that had settled over Elizabeth's life, the temporary retreat of the Thorn lawyers, the quiet, persistent support from Aidan, was shattered by a sudden, brutal biological crisis. It began with Liam, the sweet, gentle boy with the storm-gray eyes and the trusting heart. He had been unusually quiet all morning. By lunchtime, he was flushed, his small body burning with a high, relentless fever that Tylenol couldn't touch. Elizabeth, her face etched with panic, rushed him to the local clinic where Dr. Adrian Marcus immediately recognized the severity of the situation. Liam wasn't just fighting a virus. He was struggling against a sudden, aggressive infection that was attacking his little body with terrifying speed. Within the hour, Elizabeth found herself in the emergency room of the city's largest hospital, the bright, sterile lights and the harsh beeps of medical equipment amplifying her terror. The doctors were serious and fast, hooking Liam up to Forza monitors, their voices crisp and professional as they discussed tests and medications. Olivia, her sister, was terrified, clinging to Elizabeth's leg, her face buried in her mother's worn coat. "It's going to be fine, my love," Elizabeth whispered, stroking Olivia's hair, but her own voice was shaky, a desperate lie to soothe her daughter's fear. The diagnosis came back late that night, a severe, rapid bacterial infection. Liam needed aggressive, round-the-clock care, and the doctor was frank. The hospital stay would be extensive, and the specialized antibiotics and treatments would be costly. The medical staff were kind, but they needed information, insurance, financial arrangements, contact details. Elizabeth, sitting on a hard plastic chair beside her son's white hospital bed, felt the crushing weight of reality descend. Her minimal health insurance wouldn't cover the specialized care. The hospital bills, even for a single night, already soared higher than the few $100s she had managed to squirrel away in her emergency fund. For the first time in 10 years, she knew, with a terrifying certainty, that she couldn't handle this alone. She couldn't fight this battle with sheer pride and willpower. Her son's life was at stake. Just when she thought she would break completely, her phone vibrated. It was Aiden. He had been alerted by the security detail he still maintained, now a protective measure, not a surveillance tool, that Elizabeth had rushed Liam to the hospital. "Elizabeth, I'm on my way," Aiden said, his voice deep and urgent. "What's wrong? Which hospital?" Elizabeth looked at her pale, still son, connected to a spiderweb of tubes and wires, and the wall she had built around her heart over the last decade began to crack. Her pride, her fierce, unyielding shield, finally crumbled. She couldn't afford a moment more of defiance. She took a shaky breath. "Is it St. Jude's? Bacterial infection. Aiden, it's bad. The bills." Her voice failed, dissolving into a helpless sob. There was a moment of silence on the line. Then, Aiden's voice returned, low and fierce, cutting through her panic like a command. "Don't worry about the cost. Don't worry about anything. I'm coming. Do not leave his side. I will handle the rest." An hour later, Aiden Thorne was there. He walked into the sterile environment, dressed in a simple, dark sweater, looking tired but utterly resolute. He didn't ask for permission. He simply took charge of the crisis in the way only a man used to commanding armies of people and money could. He walked over to the nursing station and, within 5 minutes, had bypassed the entire billing department. He didn't use an insurance card. He simply pulled out his private, obsidian black card and spoke a few cold, decisive words to the chief administrator who had magically appeared. "My son, Liam Thorne, needs the best. Private room, round-the-clock specialists, full access to any medication necessary, domestic or international. I don't care what the cost is. I won't lose him. Send all invoices directly to my CFO. The entire Thorne organization is covering this. No expense spared." The change was instantaneous. Liam was moved to a luxurious private wing. A swarm of top specialists, doctors who were usually booked months in advance, descended upon the room. The best technology, the kind Elizabeth didn't even know existed, was brought in. Aiden walked back into the room and found Elizabeth still sitting by Liam's bedside, her face wet with tears of terror and exhaustion, holding the heavy custody documents. He gently took the legal papers from her numb fingers, ripped them into small pieces, and dropped them into the trash. "This is over. I promise. They won't touch you again." Then, he sat down in the chair opposite her, not saying another word, just taking his watch off and settling in. For the next 3 days, Aiden Thorne did not leave that hospital room. He slept in the uncomfortable armchair, waking every time a nurse entered the room or machine beeped. He didn't take calls on his corporate line. He only spoke to his CFO to ensure funds were constantly being poured into his son's care. He brought Olivia coloring books and snacks, sitting with her in the waiting area, trying to distract her from her brother's crisis. He was quiet, present, and utterly devoted. He wasn't the cold air. He was a father fighting for his child's life. Elizabeth, exhausted and humbled by the situation, could only watch him. She watched the way his strong, capable hands trembled slightly when he adjusted Liam's blanket. She watched the way he spoke to the nurses, not with command, but with genuine, quiet gratitude. On the second night, sitting together in the dim light of the hospital room, a sudden surge of medical staff rushed in. Liam's temperature spiked dangerously. Elizabeth shot out of her chair, her heart plummeting. Aidan was already at Liam's side, his massive frame shielding the small bed. He gripped Elizabeth's hand, his hand swallowing hers, his touch grounding her in the chaos. He looked down at his unconscious son, his face pale with raw fear. He didn't speak to the doctors. He spoke only to the child he had just discovered, the son he had almost lost before he even knew him. Aidan bent over the bed and whispered, his voice thick with a broken sincerity that Elizabeth had never heard before. "I don't care what it costs. I won't lose you, Liam. I just got you back. I promise you, I will stay. Fight, son, fight." Elizabeth stood there, his hand locked around hers, watching the terrifying, private moment of a father's love. She felt the warmth of his skin, the strength of his grip, and the immense, genuine fear in his soul. In that moment of shared, acute vulnerability, the last remaining walls around her heart didn't just crack. They came tumbling down. She realized that the man beside her wasn't a threat to be fought. He was an anchor in the storm. The man who abandoned her 10 years ago was dead. The man standing with her now, willing to burn his entire empire down to save their child, was a father, and he was hers. When the crisis finally passed and Liam stabilized, Elizabeth was too exhausted to stand. Aidan gently guided her to the small couch in the private room. He didn't hover. He just fetched her a cup of lukewarm water and a blanket. "Thank you," Elizabeth whispered, the words catching in her dry throat. It was the first honest gratitude she had offered him since their reunion. "Don't thank me," Aidan replied, his voice rough. "He's my son. This is my job." He looked at her, truly looked at her, his gray eyes softened by exhaustion and fear. "I'm sorry you had to face those lawyers. They're gone, and I'm going to set up a full, private trust today for Liam and Olivia's healthcare and education. It will be in their names, managed by a third party. They will never have to worry about a bill again, and you won't have to fight me for anything." Elizabeth simply nodded, too tired to argue, too grateful to refuse. She finally understood that his money wasn't a weapon against her. It was a tool of protection for their children. Her pride had almost cost her son his life. As the sun rose on the fourth morning, casting a gentle, pale light across the private room, Aidan was still there. He was dozing in the chair, his head leaned back, his hand resting lightly on the railing of Liam's bed. Elizabeth watched him sleep, watched the exhaustion smooth the harsh lines from his face. The bitterness of 10 years, the resentment, the fear, it all faded away. What remained was a simple, profound appreciation for the man who was there when they needed him most. The crisis had broken them down, but it had also brought them together. The rebuilding of their trust, founded not on romantic hope, but on the shared, terrifying love for their son, had finally begun. The atmosphere in the hospital, usually a place of sterile anxiety, had been transformed for Elizabeth. With Liam stable and recovering in the private, sun-filled room, and with Aidan a quiet, constant presence, the intense fear had finally receded. She was exhausted, but her heart was full. Her pride had been humbled, but her love had found a powerful partner. She was down in the main lobby, stretching her legs and grabbing a cup of the terrible hospital coffee, when the final piece of the Thorne family drama decided to make its appearance. Isabella Moreau looked utterly out of place in the functional, everyday chaos of the hospital entrance. She was dressed for a confrontation, not a sick child's bedside. Her sunglasses were massive, obscuring her eyes, and her outfit was a sleek, unforgiving black suit that radiated icy hostility. She looked like a predator who had wandered into a waiting room. Isabella spotted Elizabeth instantly, sitting alone on a polished wooden bench near the information desk. She walked toward her with the slow, deliberate stride of someone who knew her entrance commanded attention. Elizabeth, seeing the woman who had publicly humiliated her and whose family had tried to steal her children, didn't flinch. She had faced her deepest fears in the last few days. Isabella's polished malice no longer held the power to shatter her. Isabella stopped directly in front of Elizabeth, her shadow falling across the bench. She didn't bother with preamble. She simply reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a large, heavy manila envelope. "Let's end this farce, Waitress," Isabella said, her voice a low, cold hiss, completely devoid of the performative elegance she used in society. I know the truth now. About the letters, about the betrayal. It's irrelevant. The only thing that matters is that you're a problem I need to solve, and I solve problems with money. She tossed the envelope onto the bench beside Elizabeth. It landed with a soft, heavy thud. Inside is a settlement, Isabella continued, her voice laced with chilling contempt. Enough to buy you and your two little bastards a comfortable, anonymous life anywhere in the world. Double what Aiden's father offered. $5 million. Elizabeth stared at the envelope. It was an astonishing sum, more money than she could earn in 5 lifetimes. It could buy security, education, and peace. It could erase every single financial worry she had ever faced. The terms are simple, Isabella explained, leaning closer. You take the money, sign the non-disclosure agreement, and disappear forever. You cut off all contact with Aiden. You drop the last name Thorne from any claim, and I will ensure that the custody papers are never refiled and that the children are left in peace. Take the money, take your children, and find a dark corner of the world to raise them. Leave Aiden to his destiny. Elizabeth looked up at Isabella, meeting her eyes for the first time. She saw the sheer desperation beneath the flawless vernier. Isabella wasn't fighting for Aiden's love. She was fighting for her place, her power, and the colossal merger that was her birthright. A decade ago, the promise of security would have broken Elizabeth's resolve. A week ago, the threat of more legal battles might have made her run. But now, after seeing the terror in Liam's small face and the strength of Aiden's devotion, she was utterly unbreakable. She reached out, but instead of picking up the envelope, she simply pushed it off the bench. It slid across the polished floor and came to rest near the base of a potted plant. Keep your money, Ms. Moreau, Elizabeth said, her voice low, even, and vibrating with an own power that surpassed any title or wealth. I've fought too hard to keep my children. I've endured 10 years of poverty and betrayal because of your kind. I won't run now. She stood up, tall and straight, facing the powerful woman down. The fight is over. Aiden has chosen his family. You are the one who needs to disappear, not me. Isabella was stunned. She had expected fear, greed, or at least a negotiation. She had not expected this quiet, absolute refusal. Her mask of cold control shattered, revealing a flash of ugly, unrestrained fury. You insolent little, Isabella began, reaching out a hand, but she was interrupted. A voice, low, cold, and utterly lethal, cut through the space between them. That's enough, Isabella. Aiden had been on his way down to the lobby when he spotted his fiancée. He hadn't heard the entire exchange, but he had seen the envelope, the contemptuous sneer on Isabella's face, and the powerful, steady defiance in Elizabeth's posture. He knew instantly what was happening. Aiden walked forward, not with the rushed, clumsy anger he had shown his parents, but with the controlled, terrifying focus of a man who was utterly done. He didn't touch either woman. He simply placed his hand on Isabella's arm, his grip surprisingly firm, and spoke a few words to the astonished receptionist. We need a private meeting room. Now. He didn't wait for her to argue. He guided the resisting Isabella away from the lobby and through the double doors into a small, unused consultation room. Elizabeth watched them go, a single heartbeat of terror followed by a wave of cold relief. This time, Aiden was fighting her battle, not his own. The meeting room was soundproofed, small, and completely bare of comfort. Aiden released Isabella's arm and stood between her and the door. He was no longer the conflicted heir. He was the head of his own family, and she was an unnecessary, hostile asset. It's over, Isabella, Aiden said, his voice flat, emotionless, and colder than any Arctic wind. Isabella regained her composure quickly. Don't be ridiculous, Aiden. I was solving your problem. We can fix the PR damage. We'll announce the engagement next month. We just need to handle the Waitress properly, away from the media. I don't care about the merger, Aiden interrupted, his voice never rising above a dangerous whisper. I don't care about your family's banks or my father's expectations. I have already ended my engagement, effective immediately. Isabella scoffed, her eyes blazing with disbelief. You can't do that. The contracts are binding. The market. I will pay the penalty, Aiden stated, cutting her off. Whatever the legal cost, I will cover it. I will personally settle every financial obligation to your family to dissolve this arrangement. You and I are done. He then looked at her with a profound disappointment that was far more devastating than anger. You went to the hospital lobby. You tried to buy off the mother of my children while my son was fighting for his life. You think so little of me that you believed I would let you succeed. Your cruelty is as ugly as my mother's, and I won't have it anywhere near my family. He didn't rage. He didn't yell. He simply stated the facts, stripping her of all dignity. Isabella's face went pale. The reality of her sudden, catastrophic downfall hit her. Not only was the engagement over, but she had been caught being vicious by the one man whose respect she truly coveted. You're making a mistake, Aiden, she pleaded, her voice cracking. You will be alone, ruined, saddled with a servant and 2 children. I'm not alone, Aiden said firmly. I have Elizabeth and my children, and I have never been more certain of anything in my life. You, on the other hand, are standing here, humiliating yourself for a transaction that no longer exists. He opened the door. Our agreement is over. I suggest you collect the envelope you threw on the floor and leave. If you ever come near Elizabeth or my children again, I will personally ensure your family's name is ruined in every financial center we touch. This is your last warning. He stepped out, leaving Isabella alone in the small room, utterly humiliated and powerless, her perfectly constructed world collapsing without the benefit of a single witness. She had been defeated, not in a public spectacle, but in a quiet, closed-door moment that sealed a disgrace. Aiden walked back to the lobby. He paused by the potted plant, retrieved the crumpled manila envelope, and dropped it into the nearest recycling bin. He then walked straight back to Elizabeth, sitting down beside her. He reached out and took her hand, his strong, warm grip a silent promise. She's gone, he said simply. For good. I'm sorry you had to face that. Elizabeth squeezed his hand, a small, grateful smile touching her lips. She didn't need details. She didn't need to see the public scene. She only needed the knowledge that he had finally and completely chosen her and their children over the entire world he was born into. The battle against the forces of wealth and malice was finally over. The hospital, usually a beacon of cold, bright efficiency, took on a hushed, intimate quality in the deep hours of the night. Liam was sleeping soundly, finally breathing easy, a testament to the specialized care and Aiden's unwavering presence. Olivia was asleep on a small cot in the corner of the room. Elizabeth had been watching them both, her emotions a tangle of exhaustion, relief, and the deep, unsettling tenderness she now felt for the man who slept in the armchair across the room. Needing a moment of true solitude, she slipped out of the private room, past the watchful eyes of Aiden's hide security, and found a quiet spot on a bench outside the hospital entrance. The night air was sharp and cool, a welcome contrast to the stale warmth inside. She sat alone, her eyes swollen and red-rimmed from days of suppressed fear and nights of little sleep, finally allowing the sheer relief of Liam's recovery to wash over her. She didn't know how long she had been there when the sound of the heavy glass doors sliding open made her look up. It was Aiden. He hadn't changed clothes in days, his cashmere sweater rumpled, his face showing the honest, raw fatigue of a man who had prioritized life over empire. He walked over and sat down beside her without a word, his large presence a comforting weight on the small bench. They sat in silence for several minutes, the only sound the distant siren of an ambulance and the low hum of the city. Aiden finally broke the silence, his voice low and gravelly, like dry leaves being crushed. You shouldn't be out here alone. It's cold. I needed air, Elizabeth whispered, pulling her thin sweater tighter around her. I couldn't just keep staring at the monitors. He nodded, understanding completely. He knew the feeling of being trapped between terror and hope. He looked out at the dark, indifferent city skyline, the towers he owned seeming ridiculously small compared to the life of their little boy inside. He knew the time for secrets and carefully managed emotions was over. The crisis had stripped them both bare. He turned to her, placing his hands on his knees and leaning forward, his head bowed slightly. He spoke the words that had been churning in his soul since the truth was revealed. "I never left you, Elizabeth." His voice was a strained whisper, imbued with a decade of anguish. "That was the lie they sold you. The lie they sold me. I walked out of that bar 10 years ago because I was a terrified coward who was afraid to lose his inheritance. Yes. But the moment I realized what I had done, I wanted to come back. I wanted to apologize. I missed you every day." He looked up at her then, his striking gray eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I went back to that hotel a month later, thinking maybe you'd still be there. You were gone. I told myself you were better off without me. I tried to convince myself that you moved on, that you forgot me easily." He swallowed hard, the emotion constricting his throat. "When I heard you were trying to contact me, when I found out you had been sending letters, asking for me, the rage I felt against my parents was nothing compared to the pain of knowing what you went through, believing I was cold enough to ignore a pregnant woman's plea." He reached out and gently took her hand, his thumb stroking her cold skin. "I never stopped looking for you. I was a fool, looking in the wrong places, trusting the wrong people. But the moment I found you again, I knew. I knew my life was a lie, and you were the truth." He closed his eyes, and a single, genuine tear finally escaped, cutting a clean path through the fatigue on his cheek. "They kept us apart, Elizabeth. Every call, every letter, every chance we had to build a life. They buried it. I would have chosen you and our children over the entire world. I love you." His voice broke, ragged and choked with the pure, naked pain of regret, the sound of a strong man finally collapsing under the weight of his own sorrow. Tears, hot and steady, streamed down Elizabeth's cheeks as she listened. It was a release she hadn't allowed herself in years. The admission was the balm she never knew she needed. The absolute confirmation that her initial love hadn't been misplaced, that her heartbreak wasn't his deliberate cruelty, but the result of a calculated, external evil. She squeezed his hand back, gripping him tightly, finally finding the strength to confess her own hidden truth. "I know," she choked out, her voice thick with tears. "I saw it in your eyes the night you found out about the letters. I saw it in the hospital. I watched you fighting for Liam, and I knew you were the man I remembered, buried under years of their lies." She leaned her head forward until her forehead rested against his shoulder, letting the years of agony pour out of her. "I never stopped loving you, Aiden," she admitted, the words barely audible against his sweater. "That's why the abandonment hurt so much. I carried that love like a lead weight, and I couldn't forgive you because I thought you were cold enough to toss it away, to toss us away, for a bank account." She pulled back, looking into his tear-filled eyes, finally confronting the vast chasm between them. "I hated the man I thought you were. But the man who is here, the man who ripped up those custody papers and stayed by our son's side, I never stopped loving him." Between them lay a decade of pain, 10 years of lost moments, missed birthdays, lonely struggles, and 2 children raised in the shadows of a corporate betrayal. It was an enormous, devastating loss that no amount of wealth or apology could ever erase. But as they sat there in the cold night, their hands tightly intertwined, the shed tears washing away the residue of old resentment, they realized something profound. The decade of pain was now a shared burden. They were no longer 2 separate people battling ghosts and lies. They were a united front, broken by the past, but fiercely determined to reclaim their future. The confession was the final step, the complete, honest surrender of their pride and their hurt to the simple, undeniable truth of their enduring love. They finally had nowhere left to run but toward each other. Aiden brought their joined hands up and pressed a light kiss to her knuckles. It wasn't a demanding, passionate kiss. It was a gentle, reverent one, a promise of respect and devotion. "We can't get those years back," he said, his voice calmer now, but laced with resolution. "But we can make every minute we have left count. I'm going to spend the rest of my life proving to you and the children that I am worthy of your trust. I'm going to be the father, the partner, and the man I should have been." Elizabeth simply nodded, her hand tightening around his. The shame, the anger, The bitter self-pity, it was all gone, replaced by a quiet, fierce hope. Liam was stable, the Thorn Empire was in retreat, and the man she loved was finally, truly home. With Liam fully recovered and the shadow of the Thorn family's legal threats finally lifted, a profound, fragile peace settled over their small, unlikely unit. Elizabeth had brought the twins home to their humble apartment, but Aidan was no longer just a visitor or protector. He was an active, committed presence. The intense crisis had broken down the walls between them, and now, the slow, careful work of rebuilding trust began. Aidan knew he couldn't simply buy his way into their lives. The grand gestures of wealth, the private room, the legal threats against his parents, the vast, impersonal trust funds, had served their purpose, but what was needed now was something far more valuable: consistency in time. He started slowly. He didn't try to move them out of their small apartment. He simply integrated himself into the fabric of their routine, proving that he could handle the mundane, messy reality of their lives. His mornings, once filled with calls to New York and London, were now dedicated to the two small people who bore his name. His first attempts at fatherhood were comically clumsy. He tried to cook breakfast, convinced that his executive chef skills must translate to basic scrambled eggs. The results were disastrous. On the first morning, he managed to set off the smoke detector while attempting toast, forcing Elizabeth and the twins out onto the landing in a fit of giggles. The eggs were burnt, the coffee was weak, but the resulting shared laughter was the sweetest sound Elizabeth had heard in years. He learned quickly. He learned that Liam liked his cereal crushed and his milk cold, and that Olivia insisted on putting on her shoes entirely by herself, no matter how long it took. He started walking them to school, his imposing figure looking utterly out of place beside their bright, chattering small ones. He didn't wear a suit. He wore simple, warm layers, carrying Olivia's princess backpack and fielding Liam's endless questions about the size of his car's engine. He patiently earned their laughter. He would tell them ridiculous, made-up stories on the walk to school, weaving tales of dragons who traded stock options and princesses who ran construction companies. Liam, the gentle one, would hold his hand and look up at him with utter adoration and innocent trust. Olivia, the fiery one, remained the hardest nut to crack. She watched him with sharp, careful suspicion, but even she couldn't resist a genuine laugh when Aidan slipped on an ice patch or accidentally put on one of her bright pink mittens. Elizabeth watched all of this from the sidelines, her heart softening against her will. She saw the raw, genuine effort he put into every interaction. She saw the patience in his eyes when he tied Liam's shoes for the 5th time, and the pride on his face when Olivia finally allowed him to push her on the swing set. It wasn't the billionaire being generous. It was a father being present. She saw the subtle ways her own life was changing. She could sleep a full 7 hours because he insisted on taking the early shift with the children. She could afford to quit her draining second job. She started eating proper meals. The constant, tight knot of financial fear in her stomach finally began to loosen. She was no longer fighting alone. She was being supported by a partner, not simply an ATM. One rainy Saturday afternoon, they were all crammed into the tiny living room. Aidan was sprawled on the floor, attempting to help Liam build a complicated plastic brick castle, and failing spectacularly, much to Liam's amusement. Olivia was tucked against Elizabeth on the sofa, quietly drawing. Aidan suddenly looked up at Elizabeth, a smudge of dirt on his cheek and a baffled expression on his face as the castle collapsed. He didn't offer an excuse or a joke. He just gave her a look that was open and honest, filled with exhaustion and a deep, simple happiness. Elizabeth looked down at Olivia, then across at Liam's giggling face, then back at Aidan. The room was small, the furniture was worn, and the air smelled faintly of burnt toast and wet wool. But for the first time in years, the space felt right. It felt safe. In that small, imperfect moment, the billionaire on the floor, the waitress on the couch, and the two small, noisy children creating chaos around them. They felt like a family. It was a family that was fragile, built on a decade of betrayal and pain, but it was profoundly real. The walls of resentment and pride that Elizabeth had built so fiercely had finally crumbled, replaced by the quiet, undeniable truth that this was where they belonged. The future was uncertain, and the emotional scars were still deep, but the foundation of shared love for their children was strong enough to build upon. They were a work in progress, but they were together. The quiet, fragile happiness they had found was precisely what made them vulnerable. Isabella Moreau, stripped of her engagement, her pride, and the colossal merger she was owed, was not a woman who accepted defeat. The humiliation of being dismissed by Aiden in a storage closet at the hospital fueled a vicious, final act of revenge. She understood that she couldn't break Aiden financially, so she aimed for the only thing he held sacred, his new family. Isabella used her immense wealth and connections to orchestrate a sophisticated strike, not through lawyers this time, but through poison. A week after Aiden had fully settled into their tiny apartment life, a large, official-looking envelope arrived at the Thorne family mansion, intentionally addressed to Harold Thorne. Inside was a document that shook the fragile ground beneath Aiden and Elizabeth, a fake DNA test result. The report, professionally crafted and bearing the header of a discreet, private laboratory in Switzerland, concluded in chillingly clinical language that Aiden Thorne was excluded as the biological father of Liam and Olivia. The moment the report hit Harold Thorne's desk, he seized it eagerly. This was the clean weapon they needed, a scientific justification for the expulsion of the waitress and her children. He and Penelope arrived unannounced at Aiden's downtown office, their faces grim with victorious malice. "We told you she was a gold digger," Harold snarled, throwing the report onto Aiden's glass desk. "She was running a long con. These children are not yours, Aiden. They are bastard children she procured from another poor fellow to trap you." Penelope, looking both relieved and enraged, added, "This is your final chance to save your life. Cut all ties. We will quietly settle with her, generously, and you will return to your proper life. The board is waiting. The merger is waiting. This scandal is over." The shock of the report hit Aiden with the force of a physical blow. He read the sterile, cruel language, his heart sinking with a chilling mix of confusion and fear. He knew it was a lie, but the official nature of the document was unsettling, a testament to Isabella's ruthlessness. The news didn't reach Elizabeth through Aiden. It reached her through a venomous, anonymous phone call, Isabella ensuring her weapon found its primary target. Elizabeth was alone in the apartment when the caller, her voice electronically disguised, delivered the news about the DNA test and the demand for Aiden to cut ties. Elizabeth almost believed it herself. The report was perfectly designed to hit her deepest insecurity, the decade of pain and poverty she had endured. Her love for Aiden was new and fragile, but her pride and her memory of betrayal were deep and old. What if she was wrong? What if Aiden had been with someone else before their brief fling? A terrible, crushing doubt rose up, stealing her breath. She remembered Olivia's dark eyes, so like her own, and a wave of icy panic washed over her. What if Liam's gray eyes were just a coincidence? What if she had put them all through this trauma for a lie? When Aiden rushed home, his face grim, Elizabeth met him at the door, her eyes swollen and empty. "Is it true?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "The DNA test, are they really not yours?" Her hope, so newly built, crumpled like burnt paper. The pain of thinking she had forced her children onto a man who wasn't their father and ruined his life for a baseless claim was the most devastating feeling she had ever experienced. Aiden saw the total devastation in her eyes and knew that the lie was working its intended destruction. He walked to her, ignoring the official documents his parents had thrust upon him, ignoring the shouting match he'd just endured. He didn't offer scientific proof or legal rebuttal. He offered simple, undeniable truth. He gently placed his hands on her shoulders, forcing her to look into his eyes. "Listen to me, Elizabeth," he said, his voice deep and steady, filled with an absolute, unshakable conviction. "I was in that hospital room, watching Liam fight for his life. I saw my mother's eyes staring back at me from his small, pale face. I heard his heartbeat." He then looked toward the bedroom where Olivia was sleeping. "I've watched Olivia follow you around, fierce and protective, mirroring the same spirit that made me fall in love with you 10 years ago. I don't need a paper from a corrupt lab in Switzerland to tell me who my children are. I know my blood. Elizabeth. He pulled her into a fierce, grounding embrace. This is Isabella's last, desperate strike. She is trying to use a lie to recreate the abandonment my parents achieved with the truth. He held her away from him, looking deep into her soul. You trusted me enough to let me into the hospital. Now, you have to trust me to believe the evidence of my own eyes and my own heart. I don't need paper to know my blood, and I will not let this storm destroy everything we are trying to build. Elizabeth clung to him, the warmth of his presence and the conviction in his voice chasing away the icy doubt. Her hope, which had crumbled just moments ago, began to slowly, painfully reform. She looked at the crumpled, anxious man who had become a rock for her and realized that her love wasn't just for him. It was a commitment to him. Aidan spent the rest of the day in a flurry of activity that left his corporate enemies reeling. He filed legal action against Isabella and the Swiss lab for fraud and harassment. He publicly issued a statement confirming his parentage and his utter contempt for the malicious, fabricated attacks on his family, even going so far as to include a scathing, personal rejection of his parents' interference. He had another brief, brutal confrontation with his father, Harold. You will never use that fraudulent paper again, Aidan commanded, his voice cold and flat. I will provide the court with incontrovertible DNA proof myself, on my own terms, but I will not allow you to use this lie to slander Elizabeth or my children. You chose the paper, Harold. I choose them. The storm nearly destroyed everything they were trying to build. It had tested Elizabeth's recovered hope and Aidan's commitment. But in refusing to let a piece of paper define his family, Aidan proved that his commitment was not just emotional. It was absolute. He had chosen the truth of his heart over the cold, convenient lie. And in doing so, he cemented his place beside Elizabeth forever. The long wait for the truth was agonizing, yet utterly necessary. Aidan had immediately arranged for a bona fide DNA test from an unimpeachable, court-appointed facility, not just to satisfy the courts, but to wipe away the last vestiges of Isabella's poisonous lie and silence his parents forever. The morning the results arrived, the small apartment was quiet. Aidan held the sealed envelope, his hands steady, but the air around him was thick with anticipation. Elizabeth stood beside him, her gaze fixed on the paper, the final hurdle of their decade-long ordeal. Aidan broke the seal and unfolded the document. His eyes scanned the technical jargon and landed on the conclusion: the probability of Aidan Thorne being the biological father of Liam Thorne and Olivia Thorne is 99.9999%. The certainty was absolute, undeniable. The real test results confirmed what Aidan's heart already knew, but they also held the irrefutable power needed to crush the last enemies of their new family. The truth shattered Isabella. The moment her lawyers learned Aidan possessed authentic, court-validated DNA results, they immediately informed her that the fabricated test was grounds for massive criminal charges and financial ruin. Her last, desperate strike had not only failed but had turned her own power against her. She was ruined, silenced, and forced to retreat entirely from the public eye, her reputation permanently tarnished. The results silenced his parents completely. Aidan sent the authenticated document to Harold and Penelope Thorne with a single, sharp note: the truth. The weight of their cruelty, the stolen 10 years, the recent legal threats, and the malicious custody suit, now had irrefutable proof that it was all enacted against their own blood. They saw what their prejudice and avarice had truly cost them: their son's love, their grandchildren's lives, and their own moral standing. For the first time, their massive empire bowed not to money, but to love and undeniable biological fact. They were left utterly powerless, their threats exposed as hollow and their legacy permanently poisoned by their own actions. With the last external threat eliminated, the battle was finally, completely over. Aidan turned to Elizabeth and their children. Liam and Olivia, sensing the momentous gravity of the moment, stood quietly by Elizabeth's side. Aidan dropped to one knee, bringing himself down to the children's level, his eyes shining with profound emotion. This wasn't a corporate merger or public speech. It was the final, most important commitment of his life. Liam, Olivia, he began, his voice thick with devotion. I am your papa, and I promise you, I will never, ever leave. He turned his gaze up to Elizabeth, his heart overflowing. He reached out and took both of her hands in his, bringing them to his lips before looking her straight in the eye. Elizabeth, he promised, his voice low, firm, and absolute. We have the truth. We have our children, and we have a decade to make up for. He reaffirmed the love and commitment forged in fire and betrayal. Never again will you stand alone. We are a family, and we start today. Elizabeth smiled, tears finally falling, not from pain, but from pure, undeniable joy. She knelt beside him, wrapping her arms around her children and the man who was now, finally, her home. The simple, imperfect reality of their love had conquered the cold, complex power of the empire. The decision to leave the small, crowded apartment wasn't made out of necessity, but out of choice. Elizabeth and Aidan had spent the weeks following the DNA reveal making deliberate plans, choosing a home that represented a fresh start, not a sudden upgrade. It was a spacious, beautiful brownstone in a quiet, diverse neighborhood, far from the cold grandeur of the Thorne estate. It was warm, filled with light, and, most importantly, it was theirs. On a quiet evening, shortly after they moved in, the house smelled of new paint and takeout pizza, a perfect, imperfect domestic scent. Aidan gathered Elizabeth, Liam, and Olivia in the newly finished living room, a space that felt open and full of possibility. He was nervous. She could see it in the slight tremor of his hands, a vulnerable nervousness she had only ever witnessed when Liam was sick. He didn't wear a suit or carry a cell phone. He was simply Aidan, the father and the man who had fought for them. He knelt. He didn't use the dramatic, sweeping gesture of a billionaire proposing on a yacht. He knelt on the Persian rug in their new living room, bringing himself down to the level of his children, making it clear that this proposal was for all three of them. He pulled out a simple, elegant ring, a diamond framed by two smaller stones, representing the mother and her two children, a symbol of their unit. He didn't just hold it out to Elizabeth. He held it between his hands, offering it to the entire family. His voice was thick with emotion, husky with a decade of missed moments and a lifetime of hope. Liam, Olivia, he began, looking at his children first. Your mama is the strongest, kindest, and best person I have ever known. She is the reason I am finally the man I was always meant to be. I love her more than anything. He looked directly into their bright, eager faces. Will you let me be your father? Liam, the gentle boy, burst into happy tears immediately. He threw himself forward, wrapping his arms around Aidan's neck. Yes, Papa, yes. Olivia, the fiery one, paused for a moment, her sharp eyes studying her mother's face before finally looking at Aidan. She saw the truth, the love, and the commitment, and she, too, rushed into his arms. Yes, you our papa. Aidan held them both tightly, burying his face in their small shoulders, his own deep sobs shaking his frame. The promise of the last 4 years, the daily walks, the clumsy breakfasts, the night vigil in the hospital, culminated in that fierce, honest acceptance. Finally, he looked up at Elizabeth, still kneeling on the rug. The children had retreated slightly, giving their mother her moment. He held the ring out to her, his hand steady now. Elizabeth, my beautiful, brave Elizabeth. I know I have spent 10 years proving that I'm not the man you thought I was. I know that word abandonment is a wound that may never fully heal. He looked into her eyes, pleading not for forgiveness, but for a future. I don't just want to be their father. I want to spend every single day earning your trust and cherishing the woman who never stopped fighting for her babies. Will you let me be your husband? She stood trembling, her heart in pieces, pieces shattered by pain, but now being reformed and healed by the overwhelming love radiating from the man kneeling before her and the sound of her children's joyful sobs. The answer she had held back, the refusal she had maintained through pride and fear for 10 long years, finally became the one simple truth. She dropped to her knees in front of him, reaching out and placing her hands on his face, her eyes filled with the radiant light of acceptance. She leaned forward and whispered the answer that sealed their new life. Yes. The broken waitress, the abandoned billionaire, and the twins who brought them together finally became the family they were always meant to be. It was not a perfect family, but one built on the resilience of a mother's love, the redemption of a father's commitment, and the simple, undeniable bond of blood and heart. The new beginning was not an ending to the story, but the confident, hopeful first page of their next chapter. The wedding was quiet, private, and perfect, held in the garden of the brownstone. Dr. Adrian Marcus stood proudly as Aiden's best man. There were no Thorne family members present, only those who had proved their worth through love and loyalty. Aiden never looked back. He formally stepped down from the operational control of Thorne Holdings, installing a trusted, ethical management team, and dedicating his vast resources to two things: a foundation dedicated to supporting single working mothers and his family. The empire, though financially sound, was irrevocably changed, now bowed to the will of a man who valued family above the bottom line. Elizabeth, now Mrs. Elizabeth Thorne, became the heart of their home and the co-founder of the foundation. She taught Aiden how to slow down, how to appreciate a simple home-cooked meal, and how to understand that the greatest wealth is measured in quiet, shared moments. Liam and Olivia thrived. They were raised with the knowledge of their mother's fierce strength and their father's relentless love. They were the proud, noisy future of a family redeemed. The greatest love story, they realized, wasn't about the grand merger or the power of $1 billion. It was about the small, precious moments of connection that had survived a decade of betrayal, proving that honesty and a mother's resolve could conquer the coldest malice. After years of pain, lies, and stolen time, love finally won. Their journey was filled with tears, but in the end, it was love that healed the wounds of 10 long years. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like this video. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Also subscribe to the channel and ring the notification bell so you never miss more stories like this one.